Welcome to Sleepy Time Stories. Hello, my dear friends. Ever had a proper bath in their lives? It sounds horrible, but that was the truth for millions of women in the Middle Ages. There were no baths, no soap, and no hot water running from the tap. Personal hygiene was considered a luxury, sometimes even taboo. So, how did they live? How did they avoid being considered dirty in the community? And did everyone smell as bad as people thought? Tonight, we step into their quiet routines of wiping, rinsing, and surviving without a single real bath. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you really like what I do here. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soothing background, and let's embark on this journey together tonight. If you think skipping a shower today feels uncomfortable, then life in medieval Europe would be a big adjustment. In most homes, especially in the countryside, women had no separate place for bathing. Houses were simple. Many families lived in just one room where they ate, worked, and slept. There was no indoor bathroom. There was no private space for cleaning. There were no sinks, no faucets, and no plumbing. Every act of personal hygiene had to be done by hand, often in the open or behind a curtain, using cold water from a bucket or basin. When a woman wanted to bathe, the process began with carrying water. Water had to be fetched from a nearby stream, well, or communal source. That meant walking with heavy wooden or clay buckets. If she wanted warm water, she had to boil it over a fire. That took time and fuel. Firewood wasn't always easy to gather. Poorer families often relied on scrap wood or dried twigs collected from roadsides. Once the water was ready, it was poured into a wooden tub, usually round and shallow, placed in the center of the room or outdoors behind the house. Bathing didn't happen often. Heating water, finding privacy, and cleaning up afterward were too much work for everyday life. Most women only bathed once every few weeks, sometimes once a month. In cold weather, they avoided it altogether. Warmth was saved for survival, not comfort. Fire was used for cooking and staying alive, not for filling bathtubs, so bathing became rare and carefully planned. A woman might wait until a major holiday after childbirth or before a religious event to finally wash her whole body. Personally, I think that if I had to fetch and boil every drop of water myself, I'd skip bathing too. When it was time to bathe, it usually happened in the main living space. The wooden tub was filled with warm water if possible. The man of the house bathed first, then the older boys, then the younger children. Women bathed last. By then, the water was dirty and lukewarm or cold. It didn't matter. That was the routine. No one questioned it. Privacy was limited. A curtain might be hung or people might turn their backs. But the home was small. Everyone knew what was going on. In wealthier households, the situation was only slightly better. They might have more servants to carry water and more firewood for heating. But even nobles didn't have fixed bathrooms. Some castles had bathing rooms, but they were used only on special occasions. These rooms still required the same effort. Buckets of water heated over flames were carried up stone stairs. Bathing was always manual and slow. Public baths existed in towns and cities, especially in earlier medieval centuries. These were communal places where people could soak, scrub, and even socialize. But over time, baths became linked with disease, sin, and scandal. Some were shut down by church officials. Others simply fell out of favor. For women, especially married or high-status women, using a public bathhouse became risky. Rumors spread easily. A woman seen entering might be accused of improper behavior, so most women bathed at home or not at all. Instead of full baths, they wiped down their bodies using wet cloths. They focused on areas that felt dirtiest. The face, armpits, feet, and hands were wiped regularly. They used basins filled with warm water if they could get it. No soap was involved unless they were wealthy. Most used our ashes, vinegar, or herbal water. Towels were rough. There were no fluffy white cloths, no soft robes, and no scented lotions. These days, even a budget hotel has a private bathroom. In the past, a queen might have bathed in the same tub as her servants. Clothing helped manage hygiene. Women wore layers. The layer closest to the skin, usually a linen shift, absorbed sweat and body oils. That layer was changed and washed more often. Outer garments were reused for long periods. Washing clothes took effort. 2. Each item had to be soaked, scrubbed, wrung out by hand, and dried in the sun. In winter, drying was difficult. Damp garments often froze or stayed wet for days. Hair washing was also rare. Women covered their hair with caps or scarves. They brushed it regularly and sometimes used vinegar or herbal rinses. A full head wash happened only every few weeks, maybe even less. Combing out dirt and lice was a daily task. Mothers often did it for daughters while sitting by the fire. It was quiet, repetitive work done without fuss. It's a little funny that medieval society expected women to stay modest and clean, but gave them no tools or time to do it properly. Perfume was for the wealthy. Perfume was for the wealthy. Most women had no access to fragrance beyond herbs. Lavender, rosemary, or mint were dried and sewn into small sachets. These were tucked into sleeves or belts. A woman might rub a bit of oil behind her ears before visiting the market or church. That was considered enough. Cleanliness was measured by appearance, not scent. There was also fear around bathing. Some people believed that washing too often could make you sick. It was thought to open the pores and allow bad air to enter. Others believed water could weaken the body. These ideas spread through villages and even among the educated. So, people saw bathing not just as a burden but as a risk. Women adapted. They used cloths instead of baths. They kept their underclothes as clean as possible. They brushed their teeth with a cloth or twigs. They wiped their bodies with vinegar, and they did all this without much complaint. Cleanliness was not about feeling fresh. It was about staying presentable. That was the standard. In the evenings, a woman might bath sit quietly and wash her feet before bed. She might change into a clean shift and comb her hair. There was no mirror, no scented candle, just routine. Just enough to feel prepared for sleep. Just enough to feel prepared for sleep. And in the morning, it would begin again. Fetching water, cleaning clothes, wiping faces, and combing hair. This was the rhythm of hygiene in a world without bathrooms. No steam, no privacy, no convenience. Next, we'll see what women did on days when even wiping with water was not possible, and how they stayed clean using nothing more than cloth, herbs, and memory. There were many days when the bath never came, not because women forgot or avoided it, but because it simply wasn't possible. When heating water took too much fuel, or the weather turned cold, or there were too many chores to attend to, full-body bathing was often skipped. But that didn't mean women gave up on keeping themselves clean. Instead, they turned to something more manageable. They wiped themselves down with a cloth. This method was practical. A small basin of warm water could be prepared with far less effort than a tub. A piece of linen, often a worn-out shift, or tobe, leil, was dipped into the water, wrung out, and used to clean the skin. There was no need to undress fully, no need to move furniture, or wait until everyone left the room. No need to move furniture or wait until everyone left the room. A quiet corner and a cloth were all that was needed. The wiping usually followed a routine. Women began with their faces, then moved to their necks, underarms, hands, and feet. These were the areas that collected the most sweat and odor during the day. Other parts of the body were left untouched unless necessary, not out of laziness, but due to time, privacy, and resource constraints. It is reasonable if you've already fetched the water, heated it, and found a quiet place. Focusing on the parts that smell was a perfectly logical move. To improve the effect, women sometimes added herbs to the water. Rosemary and lavender were favorites, not for luxury, but for function. These herbs helped cover body odor and gave a faint scent that lasted for a few hours. Some also believed certain herbs had cleansing properties or could prevent illness. Whether that was true or not, it gave the act of wiping down a little more purpose. The cloths used for wiping were washed and dried after each use, if possible. In winter, drying took longer. Sometimes they were hung by the fire or wrapped in reused damp. If the clothes began to smell or feel rough, they were boiled or discarded. Many households had specific clothes just for this purpose. kept folded in a box or a drawer near the hearth, There was no mirror. Most women wiped themselves without ever seeing what they were doing. They relied on habit and touch. They felt for dirt, rough skin, or sweat and cleaned accordingly. No one commented on appearance. Looking fresh was not the goal. Feeling manageable was enough. These days, we talk about self-care routines involving 10 steps and special creams. Back then, self-care was a bowl, a rag, and enough time to wipe your neck. This wiping method was used not just in place of bathing, but sometimes daily. In warmer months, it became part of the morning or evening rhythm. Women might rise early, heat a little water, and spend a few quiet minutes wiping themselves before dressing. It didn't take long. It didn't leave them fully clean, but it helped. Young girls learned this from their mothers. There were no books, no printed instructions, and certainly no public conversations. It was something you picked up by watching, helping, and listening quietly. A girl might be asked to heat the water, fold the cloth, or carry the basin. Then one day she would be expected to do it herself. Wiping down also meant dealing with the fabric of the body. Long hair had to be pulled out of the way. Layers of clothing had to be loosened, shifted or temporarily removed. It was done discreetly. A shawl hung over a chair, a skirt raised just enough, always controlled, always quick. Women with servants had more help. A trusted maid might prepare the water, bring the herbs, and even assist with the wiping if needed. But even then, modesty ruled. A lady might allow someone to wash her feet or rub her back, but never beyond that. The rest remained private. Women guarded their bodies from view, even among other women. There was no perfume, no body lotion, and no cleansing wipes. Only warm water and a cloth. Sometimes a second basin was used to rinse, but most times one bowl had to do, and even that was better than nothing. It's a little funny to think that wiping your armpits with rosemary water was once considered good hygiene, but today we have electric toothbrushes that connect to smartphones. On days when there was no water, women relied on dry wiping. They used clean cloths to brush off dust or sweat. A pinch of flour or ground herbs was sometimes rubbed onto the skin to absorb oils. Then it was brushed away with a soft cloth or a piece of wool. This dry method didn't feel refreshing, but it kept things under control. In summer, wiping helped avoid rashes. In winter, it kept the skin from drying out too much. Either way, it was a compromise. Better than nothing. Not perfect, but enough. At night, the clothes were folded again. The bowl was rinsed or left near the hearth for the next morning. Nothing was wasted. The water might be used to mop the floor or soak laundry. The herbs were dried for reuse. Even the smallest routine had its place. It wasn't just about dirt. It was about control. In a world where many things were unpredictable, wiping your own arms and face gave a sense of order. It was one of the few acts that belonged fully to the woman herself. No one could take it away. This method lasted for centuries, even after plumbing arrived in cities. Many rural homes continued with a cloth in a basin. It was familiar, affordable, and required no explanation. Wiping became part of daily life, not a temporary substitute for something better. Looking back, it's clear that medieval women didn't view hygiene as a full transformation. They saw it as maintenance, something small they could manage, often while others were still asleep, or while the stew simmered on the fire. They didn't chase the idea of being spotless. They chased comfort and routine. Next, we'll explore how washing the hair fits into this routine and why the head was often left untouched for weeks at a time. While wiping down the body became the most common way to stay clean, hair care was treated very differently. For many medieval women, washing their hair was not part of the regular routine. In fact, it was often avoided for weeks at a time. There were many reasons for this, and none of them had to do with comfort. Washing hair took time, resources, and effort that most people simply didn't have. Unlike a clo, the wipe washing the head meant getting it fully wet, which was risky, especially in cold weather. Water ran down the neck and into the clothes. Hair took hours, sometimes days, to dry completely, especially in winter. Most homes had no way to heat a room just for drying off. Sitting around with damp hair was not just unpleasant, it was considered dangerous. People feared cold air getting into the body. Wet hair was linked to illness. As a result, many women washed their hair only when they had time, warmth, and privacy. That usually meant once every few weeks. Some went even longer. When the time came, they followed a process. First, they heated water in small batches and poured it into a bowl or basin. Next, they used simple materials to scrub the scalp. Soap was rare, so they turned to homemade substitutes. One method was to mix vinegar, especially apple cider vinegar, with water and use it as a rinse. It cut through grease and left the hair feeling lighter. Another method involved dried flowers or herbs. Some ground dried chamomile or lavender into powder and rubbed it into the scalp. Others made a sort of paste by mixing dried petals with water. This wasn't about luxury. These plants were chosen because they were accessible and smelled better than unwashed hair. Personally, I think, if my shampoo options were vinegar or flower dust, I'd start braiding my hair and never look back. After cleaning, women would rinse their heads carefully, usually with more warm water if they had enough. Then came drying. This step required patience. Without towels, as we know them today, women used linen cloths to wrap and blot their hair. They sat near the hearth or under the sun, letting the air do the work. For busy women, this wasn't practical. That's why many skipped washing entirely and turned to other methods. Instead of washing, they brushed and combed their hair regularly. Then combs were common, and some women added a little oil to reduce tangles. Brushing was a daily task for many, especially before bed. It kept the scalp stimulated, removed loose hairs, and helped distribute natural oils. A woman's brush or comb was personal. It was stored carefully, sometimes in a cloth bag, and rarely shared. Hair was usually braided or covered. Loose hair was rare outside the home. Braiding helped prevent tangles and kept dirt out. Covered hair stayed cleaner longer. Scarves, veils, or linen caps were worn daily. These weren't only for modesty or fashion. They were a way to keep dust, smoke, and sweat from settling into the hair. Some caps were plain, others were embroidered, but their function was the same. These days, people panic if they miss a hair wash by one day. In the past, skipping 3 weeks was completely normal. Covering the head also helped manage lice, which were common. Combing helped, but many women used herbal rinses to keep lice away. Some boiled rosemary or thyme and poured the warm liquid over their heads. Others wore small pouches of herbs under their caps. These didn't eliminate the problem, but they made life more bearable. Young girls learned these habits early. They helped their mothers brush hair, prepare rinses, and hang caps to dry. They were told to keep their hair neat, tied back, and clean as much as possible without washing too often. Girls with thick or long hair sometimes had it trimmed to make care easier. There were no salons, no hair dryers, and no products. Just time, cloth, and routine. Even noble women who had more resources didn't wash their hair frequently. They followed similar patterns. A lady might have a servant to assist with rinsing or combing, but the basic method remained. Wet hair was a risk. Dry brushing was safer. Clean appearances came from care, not water. Washing hair also depended on the season. Summer. It was easier. The sun helped with drying. In winter, many women gave up on it completely. Instead, they focused on keeping the scalp clean through rubbing, brushing, and herbal treatments. Washing became a seasonal task, not a weekly one. It's a little funny that in a time when hair was never washed more than monthly, people still cared enough to boil herbs just to keep it smelling nice. After a cleaning, hair might be oiled lightly. Some women used animal fat or plant oils, though these were used sparingly. They helped tame frizz and added a bit of shine. Then the hair was braided, coiled, or wrapped again. It stayed that way until the next round of care days or weeks later. There was no expectation for hair to look bouncy, glossy, or styled. It only needed to be managed. That meant no tangles, no visible dirt, and no strong odor. Most women never saw the back of their own heads. They combed by feel, trusted routine, and moved on with their day. In rural areas where dust and smoke were part of daily life, keeping hair under control was difficult. That made coverings even more important. A good cap could extend the time between washes and protect the hair from farm work, fire ash, or wind. A dusty braid was still better than a wet head in the middle of January. Hair was rarely cut short. Long hair was seen as menstrual hygiene normal and expected, especially for unmarried women. But length was not the focus. Neatness mattered more. A tidy braid or bun showed discipline. It told others that a woman took care of herself, even without modern tools. Looking at medieval hair care today might seem strange, even harsh. But for the women living it, these routines made sense. They saved time. They avoided illness. They kept a level of order in a world where little could be controlled. Next, we'll look at how medieval women handled menstrual hygiene and what it meant to stay clean when the body followed a schedule of its own. After dealing with daily routines like wiping the body and brushing the hair, women still had to prepare for one of the most personal challenges of medieval life. Menstruation came regularly, but the means to manage it were limited. There were no pads, tampons, or menstrual cups. No disposable products. No instructions are printed on the boxes. Just-time fabric and quiet adjustments were made each month with whatever materials were available. Most women used folded cloths during their period. These were small pieces of linen, wool, or other absorbent fabric cut from old clothes or bed sheets. They were folded into rectangles or rolled into bundles and placed inside the underwear or tucked into layers of clothing. Some women had simple linen trousers to hold the cloth in place. Others wore no underpants at all, depending only on how tightly their clothes fit. The clothes stayed in place through friction and movement, and they were checked and changed as often as possible. For women who could not access cloth, soft straw, moss, or animal wool was sometimes used instead. These were shaped into a pad and wrapped in fabric, then positioned to absorb flow. This method was less comfortable and less effective, but still better than nothing. Absorbency wasn't the only concern. Irritation, odor, and leakage were constant risks. Personally, I can't imagine trusting a handful of straw to stay in place, let alone to get through a full day without trouble. After use, the cloths were washed. This was done carefully and in private. The water had to be heated, and the cloth scrubbed by hand. There was no soap as we know it today. Women used ashes, vinegar, or simple herbal rinses. Once clean, the cloths were wrung out and hung to dry, usually indoors. Women avoided hanging them in shared spaces or near windows where others might see. In larger households, the clothes might be hidden behind curtains or dried in locked rooms. Privacy was important, but not always possible. A woman might have to dry her clothes at night or store them under her bed. In small homes, every corner was shared. That meant women had to be creative in managing their hygiene without drawing attention. Some kept their clothes wrapped in layers of other laundry to mask stains or smell. There were no waste bins. Nothing was thrown away. Every cloth was reused. Some lasted months. Others wore out faster. Replacing them meant cutting into precious fabric, which most households couldn't afford to waste. Old shifts and aprons were often repurposed for this task. These days, we complain if a sanitary pad doesn't stick well. Back then, women were hoping the linen wouldn't shift while walking to church. Menstruation was not openly discussed. There were no lessons, no guides, and no formal knowledge passed from one generation to another. Girls learned what to do by watching their mothers or older sisters. The first period came with confusion, sometimes fear, and often silence. A girl was told what cloth to use, how to clean it, and what not to say. Shame was common. Understanding was not. Some families believed menstruation made a woman unclean. During her cycle, a woman might be asked to sleep separately or avoid the kitchen. In certain villages, she might not be allowed to bake bread, touch milk, or enter sacred places. These beliefs varied by region and by household, but the underlying idea was the same. The menstrual body was seen as different, even dangerous. Because of this, many women practiced extra hygiene during their period. They wiped more often, changed clothes more frequently, and stayed close to home when possible. They avoided lifting, climbing, or walking long distances. Some even stayed in bed for part of the day. This was not luxury, it was caution. In noble households, menstruation was handled with more support, but still little comfort. A lady might have a maid assist with washing clothes or heating water. She might rest in a private chamber, but the materials were the same. Linen pads, herbal rinses, a private corner of the room. Being rich didn't change the lack of options. Women tried to reduce the smell with herbs. They placed small bundles of rosemary or mint near their beds. Some rubbed vinegar or rose water behind their ears or under their arms. Others used powders made of ground flowers or chalk. These didn't mask everything, but they helped. Clothing also played a role. Women often wore darker skirts or extra layers during their period. This helped cover any stains. Underskirts were chosen carefully, and some women had a specific set of clothes they used only during this time. These garments were washed separately and stored apart from other clothes. Accidents happened. When they did, women dealt with them quietly. A stain on a bench, a spot on a hem. These things were handled without fuss. There were no commercial stain removers, just water, ash, and patience. It's a little funny that for all the restrictions placed on women during their period, no one ever thought to make the cloths more comfortable or easier to use. In small communities, women sometimes helped each other. They exchanged cloth patterns, shared advice, or quietly passed along herbs that seemed to help with cramps. There was no medicine for pain, but some chewed on dried leaves or tied warm stones to their stomach. These methods offered little relief, but gave a sense of action. The emotional side of menstruation was rarely addressed. Mood changes, fatigue, or discomfort was seen as part of life. Complaining was discouraged. A woman who rested too much or spoke too often about her cycle might be labeled lazy or saint range. So most kept going, doing their chores and tending to their families, even when they felt weak. Girls grew up seeing how their mothers managed everything. Silently, they copied the same habits. They reused the same clothes. And one day they taught their daughters to do the same. The routine didn't change for generations. Despite everything, women found ways to stay clean. Not perfect, not effortless, but enough to protect their bodies and keep their dignity. In a world that often overlooked their needs, they made hygiene their own, one folded cloth at a time. Next, we'll look at how women learned about hygiene at all, and why many grew up with only whispers and guesses to guide them. By the time a girl experienced her first period, she had already seen bits and pieces of what adult hygiene looked like, but those glimpses were quiet, scattered, and often unclear. There were no guides to follow, no formal education, no school lessons, no printed books to explain how a woman should care for her body. Everything was passed down quietly from older women to younger ones in kitchens, beside beds, or near the fire when no one else was listening. Mothers and grandmothers became the only teachers. They didn't use instructions. They demonstrated through actions. They handed a cloth to a daughter, showed her how to rinse her hands, pointed to the basin, or folded a shift with extra care. Most of it wasn't explained in words. It was shown once, maybe twice, and expected to be remembered. If a girl was lucky, she had a mother who took time to teach gently. But that wasn't always the case. Some girls grew up with little guidance. If their mother was absent, busy, or simply uncomfortable talking about such things, they had to figure it out themselves. They watched, guessed, and copied what they saw. Mistakes were common. Embarrassment was frequent, but asking questions was rare. Personally, I think trying to learn how to stay clean without being allowed to talk about it sounds harder than learning to cook without ever lighting a fire. Most women believed what their mothers told them. If their mother said that cold water was better than hot, they used cold water. If someone warned against washing during certain days of the month, they listened. These ideas were not questioned. They were repeated, preserved, and followed, because there was no alternative. Over time, these habits became true in the minds of those who practiced them. Some women spent their entire lives cleaning themselves with nothing but cold water and rough cloth. They had never been told otherwise. The idea of herbal rinses or warmed basins might not have even occurred to them. Comfort was not the goal. Getting through the routine without making a mess or drawing attention was enough. These days, people look up everything online in seconds. Back then, if your grandmother didn't know how to clean something, you just stay dirty. There were also strong beliefs tied to health. Many thought that washing too often would harm the body. Some were told not to bathe during their period. Others believed that touching certain parts of the body too frequently would cause illness. These ideas weren't based on science. They came from fear, tradition, and the church. But without education, women had no way to challenge them. The lack of instruction didn't just affect physical hygiene. It also shaped how women saw their own bodies. Shame was common. A girl might not know the names of body parts. She might think bleeding was a punishment, or that body odor was a sign of sin. These beliefs could follow her for life. Without someone to explain, she carried quiet discomfort for years. In noble households, girls sometimes had governesses or wet nurses who offered limited guidance. But even there, Odesti rules kept conversation shallow. Cleanliness was taught as obedience, not self-standing. The girl was told to wash her hands, tidy her hair, and wear fresh linen. But deeper knowledge was rarely shared. In monasteries or religious homes, hygiene instructions were even more restricted. Silence was encouraged. Curiosity was discouraged. Women followed strict routines without knowing why. If a girl broke a rule or asked too many questions, she was corrected, not educated. This silence extended into adulthood. Married women often learned new hygiene practices from trial and error. No one prepared them for how to manage childbirth, nursing, or illness. They relied on neighbors, midwives, or older relatives. Sometimes they passed on habits that were helpful. Other times they passed on myths. Shared wisdom was the only real system. It wasn't organized. It wasn't always right. But it was better than nothing. It's a little funny that so many rules existed around modesty, yet no one thought to clearly explain how to clean yourself properly. Some women formed small circles of trust. A sister, a cousin, a close friend. They whispered tips. They showed each other how to fold cloths, prepare herbal rinses, or wrap hair before bed. These moments were brief and cautious, a shared task, a quiet exchange. Nothing written, nothing official, but valuable. The problem with oral instruction was inconsistency. What one woman believed was best might be considered harmful by another. One family used hot water, another warned against it. One village preferred rosemary, another swore by vinegar. With no books and no experts, everyone trusted their own version of tradition. As a result, hygiene practices varied widely. Even two neighbors might do things very differently. And if a woman moved to a new village or married into a new family, she often had to relearn everything. She was judged by different standards. What had once felt normal now seemed strange. Older women were respected for their knowledge, but not always questioned. Age gave authority, even when the information was outdated. A grandmother who had lived through many winters carried more weight than an herbalist with better advice. That meant some poor habits continued long after they should have faded. Girls with no family nearby had it hardest. Orphans, servants, and outsiders had fewer people to teach them. They watched others from a distance, picked up fragments of routine, and invented their own way of doing things. Some succeeded, others lived in confusion and discomfort. Despite these challenges, many women found their rhythm. They took the pieces they were given and built their own systems. They kept their clothes folded a certain way. They stored herbs in the same spot each month. They turned habits into routine, even if no one had taught them directly. And when it was their turn to pass it on, they did the same. They didn't write it down. They didn't explain in detail. They handed over a bowl, folded a cloth, and hoped their daughter would figure it out. Next, we'll see how medieval women used makeup and scent, not for beauty, but to cover fatigue and mask the parts of hygiene they couldn't fully manage. Without formal instruction, most women simply learned hygiene by observation and habit. But even when they did their best with water, cloth, and herbs, there were still days when it wasn't enough. Life was hard, work was constant, sleep was limited, and bathing was rare. So when all else failed, many women turned to something else entirely. They covered what they couldn't fix through color, powder, and scent. They found small ways to hide fatigue and control how they appeared to others. Makeup in medieval times wasn't about fashion creativity. It was a tool, a way to look less tired, less dirty, and more composed in front of others. Women weren't trying to stand out. They were trying not to be noticed for the wrong reasons. Pale skin, smooth cheeks, and clean scent gave the impression of order. That impression mattered, even if it wasn't entirely honest. One of the most common products used was face powder. Some women used finely ground flour or chalk. Others, especially in noble households, used white powder made from lead. It was applied with a cloth or the fingers and smoothed across the forehead, nose, and cheeks. The goal was to make the skin look pale and even. Pale skin was linked to refinement. A woman who worked outside had darker skin, so a paler appearance signaled status and protection from the sun. Lead powder was easy to find in markets and from local apothecaries. It clung to the skin and didn't wash off easily, which was seen as a benefit, but it came at a cost. Over time, it damaged the skin. Women developed sores, discoloration, and peeling. Still, they used it, often unaware of the danger or simply lacking safer alternatives. Personally, if my choices were between looking rested and risking a face full of sores, I might just choose to stay tired. Along with powder, women added color to their cheeks. This wasn't done every day, and it depended on what they had access to. A common method involved rubbing beet juice or juice from boiled radish onto the skin. It left a reddish tint that mimicked natural blush. Some women made pastes from crushed berries or used wine. These homemade mixtures were applied sparingly. A little color on the cheeks made the face look warmer and more awake. Lip color was used less often, but it did exist. One method was to mix red clay with animal fat, creating a soft paste that could be dabbed on the lips. It gave a muted red tone and helped prevent chapping. Like other beauty practices, this was not about glamour. It was about making the face look alive, even after days of work, missed baths, or poor sleep. These days, we debate whether makeup should be matte or dewy. In the past, the main concern was whether it would hide 3 weeks of exhaustion. Scent played a large role in these routines. Since full bathing was rare, women found other ways to manage body odor. Perfume, as we know it, didn't exist, but scented oils and powders did. Some women rubbed a few drops of oil behind their ears, on their wrists, or inside the collar of their chemise. These oils were made from pressed flowers, herbs, or animal glands. Lavender, rose, and rosemary were common floral scents. Musk and civet were also used, though more often by the wealthy. These came from animal sources and had a heavy, lasting smell. Not everyone liked them, but they helped cover natural body scent for longer periods. Scented cloths were another method. Small squares of fabric were soaked in herbal oils and kept in pockets or sleeves. When needed, a woman could hold the cloth to her face or tuck it inside her bodice. These cloths absorbed sweat and provided a temporary barrier against smell. Hair was also scented when possible. Some women rubbed oil into their braids or sprinkled ground herbs into their combs. This didn't make the hair cleaner, but it made it more pleasant to be near. In crowded homes or gatherings, these small efforts helped avoid embarrassment. Noble women had more access to these materials. They received gifts of perfume, powders, and oils from visitors or merchants. Their servants prepared mixtures using imported ingredients. But even poor women found ways to adapt. They hung bunches of dried herbs near the bed. They crushed petals into oil. They used vinegar mixed with mint as a rinse. It's a little funny that while medieval people feared the dangers of bathing, they had no problem rubbing undud known powders and animal grease on their faces. Women rarely talked openly about these routines. Makeup was sometimes frowned upon, especially by religious leaders who saw it as vanity. But in practice, It was widespread. Most people understood that a little powder or scent helped a woman move through the world without drawing unwanted attention. It wasn't about pride. It was about protection. Makeup also had a practical role in courtship and marriage. A woman who looked healthy and clean had better chances of finding a partner or maintaining her position. This was especially true in noble circles where appearance reflected on the whole family. A tired or pale face might be seen as a sign of weakness. A faint scent of flowers could signal care and respectability. There were no mirrors in most homes. Women applied oral hygiene powders and oils by feel-using habits passed down from older relatives. They didn't see the full effect, only how others reacted, a kind smile, a compliment, or simply the absence of a negative comment. Over time, these practices became part of everyday life. Not every woman used them, but most knew about them. They weren't seen as indulgent. They were tools, just like a comb or a cloth, another step in the quiet, constant work of caring for the body with limited means. Even when bathing became more common in later centuries, many of these habits stayed. Powder, scent, and tint remained a part of the morning routine. The reasons changed, but the action stayed familiar. And for medieval women, those small touches made all the difference. Next, we'll explore how medieval women cleaned their mouths and teeth, even without toothpaste, brushes, or dental care, as we know it today. While powders and perfumes helped medieval women manage what others could see and smell, they still had to deal with the parts of hygiene that came from within. One of the most key overlooked aspects was oral care. Even without modern dental tools, toothpaste, or professional guidance, women still had to find ways to keep their mouths clean and their breath bearable. They managed this with simple items, consistent effort, and a good amount of quiet improvisation. There were no toothbrushes in the modern sense. Instead, women used small cloths or soft twigs. The twigs were usually taken from trees like willow or hazel. These types of wood were chosen because they were flexible, fibrous, and gentle enough not to damage the gums. One end of the twig would be chewed lightly until it frayed into soft fibers. Then it was rubbed against the teeth to remove food and buildup. The process was basic but effective enough for daily maintenance. Cloth was another common tool. A strip of clean linen was wrapped around a finger and used to scrub the surface of the teeth and the inside of the cheeks. This method allowed for a bit more control, especially for women who didn't have access to suitable wood or lived in areas without those trees. The clothes were rinsed after use and hung to dry, and were often used repeatedly until they wore out. Personally, if I had to choose between chewing a tree branch and rubbing my gums with a rag, I'd probably end up doing both and calling it a day since there was no toothpaste. Women relied on what they had. Salt was widely used. It helped scrape away buildup and acted as a mild disinfectant. Some women dipped their twig or cloth in dry salt before scrubbing. Others dissolved it in warm water and used the mixture as a rinse. The salty flavor wasn't pleasant, but it was familiar. Ashes were also used. Wood ash from clean fires was sifted and mixed with a bit of water to make a gritty paste. This acted as a natural abrasive, helping remove stains and food residue. It was harsher than salt and sometimes irritated the gums, but many people believed it kept the teeth whiter. Another option was dried sage. Sage was known for its antibacterial properties and strong flavor. Leaves were dried, ground into powder, and rubbed directly onto the teeth or mixed with a little vinegar or water. The result was a sharp, bitter taste that left the mouth feeling cleaner. Some women also chewed fresh sage leaves, letting the oils coat their teeth and tongue before spitting them out. These days, people choose between mint, cinnamon, and bubblegum flavors. Back then, it was salt, smoke, or whatever plant grew near the door. Mouthwash in a basic form did exist. A simple rinse made from wine or white spirits was used to freshen the mouth and fight odor. To make it more effective, women added herbs, rosemary, mint, and thyme, were boiled with water and mixed into the alcohol. The mixture was kept in small bottles or ceramic jars and used sparingly. A small sip, a few swishes, and then either swallowed or spat out, depending on preference and availability. Some believed these rinses could cure illness. They were said to cleanse the mouth, balance the humors, and prevent bad air from entering the body. Whether that was true or not, the herbs made a difference in breath, and the alcohol kept things from spoiling. There were no flossing tools. Women used their fingernails or the tips of small twigs to dislodge food stuck between their teeth. In wealthier homes, toothpicks made from bone or metal were sometimes available. These were kept with grooming kits and carried in small leather pouches or wooden boxes. The appearance of teeth varied depending on diet, status, and hygiene habits. Peasants who ate more grains and vegetables often had better teeth than nobles who consumed more sugar, wine, and soft foods. Tooth decay did happen, but slowly. Without processed foods or candy, the buildup was different. Gum disease, H.O.V. was common. Bleeding gums, loose teeth, and chronic pain were part of aging for many women. To ease discomfort, some women chewed on cloves or placed warm cloth soaked in herbal water against their cheeks. Others used honey mixed with herbs to coat painful spots. These remedies were not cures, but they offered temporary relief. If a tooth needed to be removed, it was pulled without medicine. That job fell to whoever was willing, often a family member or village healer. Despite the difficulty, many women took pride in keeping their mouths presentable. Clean breath mattered, especially in social or religious settings. No one wanted to be whispered about during mass or gossiped about at market. Even without mirrors, a woman could feel when her mouth wasn't right. She could taste the sourness or feel the grime. That was enough to push her into action. Children learned by watching. They saw their mothers chew on sage or rinse with herb wine. They were handed small twigs, shown how to chew and rub. The habit stuck. There was no praise for doing it well, but not doing it at all could lead to quiet judgment from others. Servants were often responsible for preparing these rinses and grinding herbs. In noble homes, a lady's maid kept track of powders and cloths. But even among the wealthy, there was no escaping the fact that oral care was unpleasant and mostly improvised. People did what they could with what they had. It's a little funny that medieval people feared bathing for opening their pores, but had no problem rubbing ashes directly into their mouths every morning. The idea of smiling to show white teeth didn't exist. A neat mouth was the goal, not a shining one. As long as the breath was tolerable and the teeth not visibly black, a woman was considered clean enough. Looking back, their methods were rough, but they were consistent. That consistency made a difference. Salt, cloth, twigs, and herbs, day after day. Not glamorous, not perfect, but enough to carry on. Next, we'll look at how women cared for their most sensitive areas, using nothing more than herbal water, rags, and a few careful tricks passed down through generations. After taking care of their teeth and breath with cloths, herbs, and rinses, medieval women still had one more part of hygiene that required attention and care, though it was rarely spoken about. The intimate areas of the body were treated with the same combination of practicality and silence as everything else. There were no special products, no ready-made bottles, no guidance from doctors, just plants, cloth, and whatever a mother or grandmother had once whispered. Most women cleaned their genital area using warm herbal water. This wasn't a full bath, and it didn't involve soaking. Instead, they prepared small amounts of water infused with common herbs and used a cloth to wipe or dab gently. Two of the most trusted herbs were mugwort and Vietnamese balm. These plants were valued for their scent and their supposed healing properties. Mugwort was believed to ease irritation. Vietnamese balm was used for freshness and comfort. The herbs were usually dried and kept in bundles. When needed, they were boiled in water for a few minutes, then left to cool. The liquid was strained and poured into a ceramic bowl or small basin. A cloth was dipped in, run out, and used to gently clean the outer area. This was done privately, usually while squatting over the bowl or sitting on a low stool. It was not done quickly or in public. This part of the body was seen as private and even sacred in some beliefs, but also as something that needed to be controlled. Personally, I think that sitting over a steaming bowl of mugwort water sounds more like a ritual than a routine, but I'd still rather do that than go weeks without cleaning anything. Women avoided using their bare hands for this task. Even when privacy allowed for undressing, they still preferred clothes. Using hands was seen as improper, especially for unmarried women or girls. It was also believed that touching too much might lead to illness, infertility, or moral weakness. These were not scientific ideas. They were folk beliefs repeated over generations tied to modesty and superstition. Because of this, women kept specific clothes for intimate care. These were smaller, softer, and used only for this purpose. Afterward, they were washed separately and dried out of sight. In poor households, a single cloth might be reused for months. In wealthier homes, they were changed more often. Either way, the cloth was never shared. There were no commercial feminine washes, no scented gels, or cleansing foams. Everything came from herbs, clean water, and old habits. Some women added salt or vinegar to the wash water, believing it helped prevent infections. Others used chamomile or yarrow. What mattered most was routine. Skipping this step for too long led to discomfort, odor, or fear of judgment. These days, entire supermarket aisles are filled with intimate care products. Back then, all you needed was a boiled leaf and a clean cloth. Girls learned these routines slowly. Most were not told directly. Instead, they watched their mothers or older sisters prepare the herbal water and disappear behind a curtain. At some point, a girl would be handed a cloth and shown where the herb bundles were kept. Nothing was written, nothing was explained in full. It was just expected that she would do the same. In colder months, preparing warm herbal water was harder. Firewood was scarce. Water was slow to heat. Still, women made the effort. The discomfort of cold wash water was better than the feeling of not being clean. In warm weather, the herbs were more accessible, and the whole process felt easier. For some women, especially those living alone or with limited resources, even this form of hygiene was difficult. Without someone to teach or help, they had to guess. Some skipped the practice altogether and relied on wiping with dry cloths. Others tried to keep clean with plain water. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than nothing. Smell was always a concern. Without regular washing, odor builds up quickly, especially during menstruation or illness. Herbal water helped. Some women also wore small sachets of dried herbs tied to their waist or tucked into their chemise. These didn't stop the odor, but they helped mask it slightly. The clothes themselves were stored carefully. Most women had a small box or wrapped bundle hidden among their personal items. These cloths were never used for other parts of the body. Reusing rags for general wiping or cleaning the house was common, but not in this case. This part of hygiene had its own tools, however simple. There was also fear attached to this kind of care. Some women believed that if they cleaned too often, they might disturb the natural balance of the body. Others were told that cold herbal water could harm fertility. Whether these ideas came from local midwives, older relatives, or traveling healers, they were taken seriously. But in spite of all the limits, women found ways to manage. They stuck to routines, adjusted by season, and paid attention to what made them feel right. Clean didn't mean sterile. It meant fresh enough to go about your day without discomfort or shame. It's a little funny that for all the shame and secrecy surrounding female hygiene, the only thing standing between women and infection was a pot of boiled weeds. Midwives sometimes gave advice. In villages, they were the closest thing to health authorities. They might recommend certain herbs for itching, others for after childbirth, and some for daily care. Their knowledge varied, but many women trusted them more than any priest or physician. Global women followed similar routines, but with more help. A maid might prepare the herbal water, bring clean cloths, and wait outside while the lady took care of herself. Still, the process was quiet, hidden, and not discussed. No one asked about it. No one described it openly, but most women did it in some form or another. It was part of staying comfortable, part of being able to sit with others, pray at church, or sleep through the night without distraction. Looking back, it's clear how much women relied on their own discipline to maintain intimate hygiene. There were no reminders, no products, no schedules, just memory, habit, and the quiet pressure of knowing that being clean, even a little, made everything else more bearable. Next, we'll see how women managed to hide body odor throughout the day using subtle tricks that fit into their clothing and daily movements. Even with herbal water, careful wiping, and regular routines, there were still days when women didn't feel fully clean. Medieval life involved physical work, heavy clothing, and shared spaces. Sweating was constant, bathing was rare, and most people lived close together. In that environment, body odor became something women couldn't eliminate completely, but they could try to manage, and most of them did, not by changing their bodies, but by learning how to mask the smell. The most common tool was a scented cloth. Many women carried a handkerchief or small square of linen soaked in oil or crushed herbs. This cloth was folded and tucked into a sleeve, belt, or carried in the hand. When the scent of sweat or smoke felt overwhelming, the cloth could be held to the nose or rubbed lightly on the skin. It didn't remove odor, but it distracted from it long enough to get through a conversation or a public gathering. These handkerchiefs were usually treated with rosemary oil, rosewater, or lavender. The scent came from herbs grown in gardens or collected in fields. The clothes were made at home and refreshed as needed. In wealthier households, they might be made of finer fabric and stored in small decorative cases, but the function was the same for all women. Personally, I think I'd need more than one scented cloth if I had to live in layers of wool without bathing for 2 weeks. Another method was to wear small herbal pouches. These were tiny bags sewn from scrap fabric and filled with dried herbs or crushed flowers. They were tied with a string and hung inside the bodice or around the waist. Some were worn near the chest, others near the hips. The idea was simple. The pouch released scent close to the body, covering or blending with natural smells. Common herbs used in these pouches included sage, thyme, lavender, and mint. Some women added cloves or dried orange peel when available. These combinations were chosen not just for their fragrance, but because many were believed to ward off illness. If a woman could not prevent body odor, she could at least feel like she was protecting herself from disease. These days, we spray perfume and walk into clouds of mist. Back then, women wore little pockets of dried salad just to feel socially acceptable. Layering clothing was another key strategy. Women wore multiple garments not only for warmth but also to manage sweat and smell. The innermost layer, usually a linen shift or chemise, absorbed moisture and body oils. This layer was changed and washed more frequently than the outer garments. A clean shift helped a woman feel fresher and kept her dresses from becoming too soiled. Shifts were made of plain linen, easy to rinse and hang to dry. They were often the only piece of clothing washed weekly, depending on weather and access to water. Outer gowns, coats, or aprons were brushed or aironed out, but rarely washed. They were heavy, expensive, and slow to dry. Instead of cleaning them, women protected them by keeping the underlayers as clean as possible. When a woman felt her shift was too damp or smelly to wear, she changed it, even if that meant using her only spare. In wealthier homes, ladies had multiple shifts and access to servants who could wash and press them. In poorer homes, 1 or 2 shifts had to last through the whole season. Clothing also helped trap scent. A well-wrapped shawl or thick apron could keep smells close to the body and away from others. This wasn't ideal, but it worked well enough for short trips to the market or church. Some women wrapped cloths around their necks or wrists, places where sweat tended to linger. Others lined their bodices with sprigs of dried herbs. Men also smelled, often more than women. But women were judged more harshly. A woman who smelled too strongly might be seen as careless, unclean, or sinful. So even when they couldn't control the scent, many women tried to appear like they had. They stood at a distance. They spoke softly. They limited movement to avoid drawing attention to the odor. Smell was also tied to class. Nobles used more fragrance. They could afford imported oils and spices. They had servants to wash linens and refresh their garments. But even among the rich, people knew the limits. A duchess who smelled like roses still hadn't bathed in a week. The perfume was a cover, not a cure. It's a little funny that in a world where people feared hellfire and illness, the biggest worry for many women was whether someone could smell yesterday's sweat through 2 layers of linen. Women taught each other these tricks. A mother might show her daughter how to make a herb pouch, how to fold a scented cloth, or how to layer clothes for the best effect. These weren't grand lessons. just quiet moments, shared during chores or dressing. Once learned, they became habits. Some women burned herbs in small clay bowls to scent their rooms and clothing. Others hung bundles of dried plants near their beds or windows. Even bed sheets, rarely washed, were sometimes rubbed with scented oil or hung outdoors to absorb fresh air. These efforts were small, but they helped create the feeling of cleanliness, even when true cleanliness was out of reach. The church sometimes frowned on excessive fragrance. Scent was linked to vanity, temptation, or false appearances, but most people ignored those warnings. The choice was between a modest scent or an obvious odor, and most women chose the former. They weren't trying to attract attention. They were trying to avoid it. Some women even brought scented cloths to funerals or crowded churches where heat and lack of ventilation made the smell of unwashed bodies hard to bear. The cloth served both as a handkerchief and as a shield against overwhelming air. A small tool, a big difference. Looking back, these habits show how resourceful women were. They couldn't stop sweating, they couldn't bathe often, but they learned how to work with what they had. Herbs, cloth, and patience. That was their system. Quiet, repetitive, practical. Next, we'll explore how clothing itself became a form of hygiene, acting as a barrier between sweat, dirt, and the rest of the world. Covering odor with herbs and cloth worked well enough in daily life, but in the end, nothing protected a woman from dirt, sweat, and judgment more than her clothes. Garments were not just for modesty or warmth. They were the final layer of hygiene in a world without bathrooms, laundry machines, or deodorant. What a woman wore played a major role in how she felt and how others perceived her. Most women rest in layers. The innermost layer was a chemise or shift made of coarse linen. It rested directly against the skin, absorbing sweat, oils, and any dirt from daily tasks. This piece was simple, long, and loose. Some had, or heavier linen. These outer garments were rarely washed. The material was thick, hard to dry, and costly to maintain. Instead of cleaning the dress itself, women brushed it off, aired it out, and let the underlayer do the hard work. Sometimes, aprons were added to protect the front of the dress during cooking or cleaning. Aprons could be replaced or rinsed more easily. In colder months, outer layers became thicker and longer. Coats, cloaks, and shawls were added. These didn't just provide warmth. They also helped hide stains, frayed hems, and the smell that might cling to under layers. A thick wool cloak could mask both appearance and scent. It wrapped around the body like a shield, protecting the woman from outside judgment and her neighbors from her natural odor. These days, we rely on fabrics that wick moisture and breathe easily. Back then, they relied on 3 layers of linen, 2 of wool, and a prayer that no one got too close. Dressing in layers was more than just a strategy. It was necessary. Women wore their clothes for long hours, sometimes days. They worked in kitchens, gardens, and fields. They carried children, hauled water, and sat by smoky fires. Clothes caught everything the body released without frequent bathing. The only way to stay respectable was to cover the body as thoroughly as possible. At night, the shift was often the only garment removed. It might be hung near the fire to dry or washed if there was time. Some women slept in a fresh shift if they had one. Others wore the same one for days. In noble homes, servants helped remove layers, brush garments, and prepare clean shifts. In poorer homes, women did everything themselves, sometimes washing a shift while still half-dressed in another. Color played a role too. Outer clothes were often dark, patterned, or dyed with plants that helped hide dirt. Inner garments were plain and pale. Stains showed easily on a shift, which was useful for knowing when it needed washing. On the other hand, dark cloaks and dresses hid everything. A woman could wear them for weeks without drawing comment, as long as the linen beneath was clean. Smell control depended on materials. Linen absorbed moisture and dried quickly. Wool resisted dirt, but held on to scent. Cotton was rare. Silk was used only by the rich and had to be treated delicately. Most women worked with what they had. If they could afford extra shifts, they rotated them. If not, they rinsed and reused until the fabric wore thin. Clothes also protect against skin problems. Layers reduced friction, shielded against insects, and limited exposure to dust and smoke. A woman who wore a proper shift and clean apron had fewer rashes and infections than one who wore the same dress without any lining. Storage mattered. Garments were hung near the fire to keep dry or folded in wooden chests with herbs. Some women added lavender or rosemary to their clothing trunks, hoping to keep garments smelling pleasant. Others hung their dresses in open windows, letting the breeze do what a bath could not. Washing out of garments happened rarely, and only in warm seasons. The process was long. Water had to be hauled, heated, and scented. Garments were soaked, scrubbed on wooden boards, and wrung by hand. Drying took hours or even days. For this reason, most women owned as few outer pieces as possible. A ruined dress meant private doctor by accident, weeks of repair or replacement. It's a little funny that in a time when people feared illness from bathing too often, they thought nothing of wearing the same cloak for an entire season. Children learned early how to care for their clothes. Girls were taught to fold garments, patch holes, and spot stains. They practiced layering their outfits correctly and keeping their shifts clean. Older girls helped younger siblings get dressed. These routines became second nature. Dressing properly was also tied to morality. A woman who wore too few layers or exposed too much skin might be judged harshly, even if she was clean underneath. Modesty and hygiene were often seen as one and the same. A neatly dressed woman, fully covered, was assumed to be well kept. Whether or not she had bathed was a separate issue. Even women who worked in the fields took pride in their layering. A patched shift, a clean apron, a tidy cap. These were signs of care and discipline. They showed that the woman respected herself and her community. Appearance was the first defense, and clothing was the first tool. Looking back, it's clear how much work women put into managing their hygiene through what they wore. Without products, machines, or services, they used linen, wool, and habit. They dressed each morning with purpose, knowing that their garments were doing more than just covering them. They were carrying the burden of every missed bath and every hard day. Next, we'll look at the quiet role of servants and maids, and how they became the behind-the-scenes caretakers of other women's hygiene. Behind every noble woman who appeared clean, composed, and neatly dressed, there was usually someone working quietly in the background. That person was often a servant, usually female, whose job extended far beyond sweeping floors or preparing meals. In many households, the maid or lady's attendant became something else entirely: a personal caregiver, a silent witness, and at times a kind of unofficial nurse. Though no one called her that out loud, she was expected to manage much of what we would now associate with basic health and hygiene. Helping a noble woman stay presentable was not a simple task. Each day began with dressing, which was a layered process. The maid helped remove nightcloth. As inspected shifts for stains, fetched clean ones if available, and assisted in arranging layers correctly. She had to make sure everything was in order, from the tightness of laces, to the folding of sleeves, to the folding of sleeves. The goal was not just beauty, it was an order. A woman who looked neat was assumed to be clean, and that illusion often depended on the quiet work of her servant. Cleaning the body was part of the routine, too. The maid brought warm water and folded cloths and waited behind a screen while the lady wiped herself. Sometimes the servant was asked to help with hard-to-reach areas: the back, the feet, and the hairline. There were no gloves, no tools, just hands, cloth, and trust, cloth, and trust. It was a daily duty, often done without complaint. Personally, I think being asked to rub someone else's feet with vinegar water before breakfast is a strong test of loyalty. Hair was another responsibility. The maid brushed it out, untangled knots, oiled the ends, and plaited it tightly. She cleaned the comb, stored the ribbons, and gathered loose strands from the floor. A proper hairstyle took time, and repeating it each morning required attention and patience. If the lady had a wig or hairpiece, the maid also cleaned and styled it. On some days, especially before formal gatherings or religious events, the maid prepared a warm basin or bath. She fetched water from the kitchen, or, carried it upstairs and poured it carefully into a tub. If herbs or scented oils were requested, She steeped them first. Then she held up towels, emptied the used water, and washed the cloths afterward. Her clothes often got wet in the process. These days, people pay extra for spa services. In medieval times, that experience came with carrying your buckets and not telling a soul about it. Toiling was the most private task, and yet the maid was often present for that. 2 chamber pots had to be emptied. Negats needed wiping. Infirm or older women needed assistance standing or sitting. The maid handled all of it. No one said thank you. No one asked how she felt about it. That was simply her role. What she saw and did stayed unspoken. Silence was part of the job. Even among other servants, she was not supposed to repeat what she had witnessed. Sores, smells, changes in mood, or moments of physical weakness. A good maid kept secrets. A loyal one kept them forever. These expectations extended to medical care. If the lady had a fever, the maid wiped her face. If she had cramps, the maid prepared herbal wraps. If there was bleeding, swelling, or discomfort, the maid cleaned and dressed the area. She wasn't trained. She learned by doing or by watching older servants. There were no manuals, just routine instinct and the memory of how things had been handled the last time. Maids also managed laundry. That included soiled shifts, menstrual cloths, handkerchiefs, and anything that absorbed body fluids. They boiled water, stirred linen with sticks, rinsed, wrung, and hung each item to dry. They handled stains quietly. If something could not be saved, they patched it or hid it. Their work made sure that no one outside the house ever knew what had gone wrong inside. They were also expected to maintain a calm presence. If the lady was nervous, the maid remained still. If she was angry, the maid listened. If she cried during cleaning, the maid did not speak. The relationship required balance. Distant enough to be proper, close enough to be useful. In some homes, the maid was the only person who truly knew the condition of the lady's body. Doctors were called rarely and only when necessary. Husbands might not know about infections, weakness, or recurring pain, but the maid knew. She saw the changes, washed the cloths, and noticed the new bruises, and she remembered. It's a little funny that in a house full of staff, the person who did the most medical work had no title, no training, and no recognition. Young girls entering service started by assisting older maids. They learned which herbs to boil, how to fold cloths, and when to speak. They watched quietly and copied the routines. Over time, they became the main caregiver, the one the lady called first in the morning and last before sleep. Trust was earned over the years. A maid who kept her place, protected her lady's privacy, and never gossiped, became irreplaceable. She might not have had her room or fine clothes, but she was valued in a different way. Some stayed with the same woman for decades, witnessing every illness, pregnancy, and grief. In return, the lady sometimes showed small kindnesses, a warmer cloak, a better meal, or a quiet word of thanks. But there was always a distance. One washed, the other was washed. That boundary stayed in place no matter how many years passed. Looking back, it's easy to see how vital these women were. They were not called doctors. They were not treated like family, but their hands carried out the work that kept others comfortable, clean, and dignified. Without them, the routines would have broken. The appearances would have failed and no one would have looked as proper as they needed to. Next, we'll explore the simple personal tools that made hygiene possible. Small items kept in wooden boxes and guarded as carefully as gold. The hands of a maid might have performed the daily tasks, but much of a woman's hygiene still depended on the small tools she owned and kept close. These weren't luxurious objects or specialized instruments. They were simple, practical items, often handmade or passed down. A wooden comb, a face cloth, a clean basin. These everyday objects formed the foundation of personal care. Without them, even the most dedicated hygiene routine would have fallen apart. Nearly every woman, regardless of class, had a comb. The most common kind was made from wood. Some were carved from a single piece, with teeth that varied in width. One side was for detangling, the other for smoothing. Combing was done daily, especially in the morning, and before bed. It helped control hair, remove lice or dirt, and spread natural oils from the scalp to the ends. Wooden combs could last for years if cared for. They were oiled, wiped clean, and stored carefully. Face cloths were also considered essential. These were small pieces of linen or wool, usually cut from worn garments. They were used to wipe sweat, clean the face, or freshen the hands and neck throughout the day. A woman might keep one tucked into her sleeve or belt, ready to use when needed. The cloth was washed regularly and was never shared, unless there was no choice. Another key item was the water bucket, a sturdy wooden pail with a handle. It was used to fetch, carry, and store water for all hygiene activities. In larger homes, multiple buckets were kept in rotation, and servants filled them. In smaller households, women carried them themselves, walking long distances to wells or streams. Water was used sparingly. A single bucket might need to cover washing the face, soaking cloths, and even rinsing a comb. Personally, I think if I had to carry every drop of my wash water from a stream, I'd think twice before washing anything at all. Other tools included scraps of cloth used for wiping the body. These were not fancy or specially made, just soft, worn fabric that had already served another purpose. Old shifts, pillowcases, or baby clothes were often cut into squares. These pieces were folded and stored in bundles used for everything from wiping underarms to drying the feet. Pumice stone was another item found in many homes. Rough but effective, it was used to scrub hardened skin, especially on the heels and elbows. Some women also used it on their hands to remove calluses. It was not comfortable. The stone could be harsh, especially on delicate skin, but it was one of the only options available for exfoliating the body. It was stored dry, wrapped in cloth, and taken out when needed. Needles were more commonly associated with sewing, but they also played a role in hygiene. Small splinters were removed using sewing needles. Ingrown hairs were picked free. Some women used needles to pull out small thorns from their feet or hands after working in the garden. A clean needle warmed by the fire became a minor medical tool in homes where no doctor would ever come. These personal items were usually stored together in a wooden box or a woven basket. The box was often kept under the bed or inside a trunk. It held a woman's most private tools, including her comb, cloths, herbs, small scissors, and sometimes a mirror, if she was lucky enough to own one. The box was not shared, even between sisters. These items were considered personal. Lending a comb or cloth was done only in emergencies. These days we have entire bathroom drawers filled with gadgets. Back then, a woman kept everything she needed for hygiene in one wooden box the size of a loaf of bread. In noble homes, the box might be decorated or locked. A lady's maid was often in charge of keeping it stocked and clean. In modest households, the box was simple and sometimes homemade, but its contents were important. If something was lost or damaged, it might not be replaced for months. These tools were not labeled or organized with dividers. A woman simply knew where things were. She folded her clothes a certain way. She tucked the comb into the same corner each time. The repetition kept things familiar and easy to find. Over time, the tools became extensions of the routine. A girl might remember her mother dipping a cloth in warm water or using the same needle for 20 years. These memories shaped how she formed her own habits. By the time she was grown, she had her own box, her own clothes, and her own way of doing things, just like the women before her. The box also carried signs of a woman's life. A worn comb spoke of long hair and daily care. A frayed cloth told of years of wiping and rinsing. A cracked pumice stone showed how often the feet were scrubbed. These tools aged alongside their owners. The simplicity of the items didn't mean they were unimportant. On the contrary, losing one could throw off a routine. If a cloth tore and no replacement was ready, the day's washing might be skipped. If a comb broke, hair tangled, and headaches followed, so women took care of their tools, not out of sentiment, but out of necessity. It's a little funny that so much of daily hygiene depended on a few items that today would barely fill a travel bag. Children grew up watching how these tools were used. They helped fetch water, rinse cloths, or oil combs. They were taught not to touch the private box unless told. A daughter might receive her own set of clothes or a small box. When she reached womanhood, it marked a step toward independence. even if the tools inside were plain. These small items didn't offer luxury, but they offered control. In a world full of unpredictability, with weather, illness, and hunger always close, the simple act of reaching for the same cloth each morning gave a sense of order. It meant something was still within reach. Something was still yours. Looking back, it's easy to see how these tools held quiet power. They weren't discussed or displayed, but they helped women stay clean, calm, and composed, one cloth at a time. One comb through the hair, one needle near the fire. Next, we'll look at where these routines actually took place. In the makeshift wash stations in the middle of homes, yards, or hidden corners that served as private spaces for public lives. The tools may have been simple, but the spaces where medieval women cared for their bodies were even simpler. There were no bathrooms, no tiled washrooms, and no spaces designed for privacy. Hygiene had to happen wherever there was room and water. That meant most daily routines took place in the middle of living areas, beside the fireplace or outside in the yard. These spaces were not created for comfort. They were created out of necessity. In most households, the washing area was a wooden basin placed in the corner of the main room or out near the back wall of the house. There were no fixed fixtures or plumbing. The basin might sit on a bench or the ground, depending on who was using it. It was filled by hand, emptied by hand, and cleaned with leftover water and ashes. Once the washing was done, the basin was set aside to be used again for something else, like laundry or soaking vegetables. Water was fetched from wells or streams, carried back in buckets made of wood or metal. The same bucket used to wash a face might later be used to rinse dishes or clean tools. There was no clear line between kitchen water, cleaning water, and hygiene water. What mattered was availability. On days when water was limited, hygiene routines were skipped altogether. There was little privacy. In homes with only one room, everything happened within view of others. Women might turn their backs, hang a cloth for modesty, or wait until children were outside, but true isolation was rare. Washing became something quick and quiet. No one stared, but no one pretended not to notice either. Personally, I think it would be very difficult to focus on wiping my face if I knew 3 people were also kneading bread right next to me. Outdoor washing happened more often in warm weather. A wooden tub or shallow barrel might be placed in the yard behind the house. There, women could rinse their feet, scrub a cloth, or wash their hair. Sometimes they washed children in the same space. The tub was used for many purposes and shared by the entire household. It was not left filled. Water was poured in for each use and emptied immediately afterward. Bathing or wiping took place quickly. The wind, dirt, and curious animals made outdoor hygiene unpredictable. A passing neighbor might see something. A goat might drink the rinse water. These were not emergencies. They were part of life. Everyone understood the limits. As for toilets, there were none. The idea of a flushing toilet did not exist in most of medieval Europe. Instead, people used chamber pots indoors or found private spots outdoors. In towns, waste was collected in buckets and dumped into trenches or rivers. In the countryside, it was often poured into open ditches or shallow pits dug near the house. The smell was constant, especially in the summer. These days, people complain when a bathroom doesn't have scented soap. Back then, a family felt lucky if the waste pit didn't flood after the rain. In noble households, there were slightly better arrangements. Some castles had small stone rooms with wooden seats built over holes that led to cesspits. These rooms were sometimes referred to as guard-robes. Still, they lacked water and had no method for flushing. Servants had to clean them by hand using ash, herbs, and water to reduce the smell. Even in royal settings, the odor never truly left. Each morning, chamber pots were emptied and cleaned. This job often fell to the servants or the younger members of the household. They carried the contents outside, dumped them in designated areas, then rinsed the pots with water and ash. Ash was useful not only for cleaning but also for absorbing liquid and controlling odor. A few handfuls sprinkled in the bottom of a pot made a difference. These cleaning routines became part of daily life. No one expected pristine conditions. The goal was simply to avoid buildup and keep living spaces manageable. In homes without servants, women did this themselves, often first thing in the morning, before others woke up. Ash was also used for cleaning floors, wiping tables, and scrubbing the basins where women washed themselves. Mixed with water, it created a basic form of soap. It was rough on the skin, but better than nothing. Many women had dry hands and cracked nails from years of using ash to clean everything. Children were taught early to help with these tasks. They fetched water, carried waste, and learned which corners of the yard were best for privacy. There was no shame in it. These chores were part of growing up and part of surviving in homes with no plumbing and limited space. Women created small zones of privacy when they could. A curtain hung from the ceiling, a bench turned sideways. A stool was placed near the fire. These spaces became makeshift washrooms. In the early morning or late evening, a woman might finally find a quiet moment to rinse her face or change her shift. It's a little funny that in homes built without walls, women still found ways to carve out small corners for dignity and quiet. In towns, public bathos sometimes provided a place to wash, but many women avoided them due to reputational risk. Instead, they stayed home and made the most of what they had. A small bowl, a clean cloth, a few minutes by the fire, before the room filled with noise and movement again. Even during illness, the same scent as a weapon, spaces were used. A sick woman might be washed in the same basin where she once soaked her feet. There was no special equipment, only extra care. The water was warmed, the cloths were changed more often, but the space stayed the same. Looking back, it is clear how much effort it took just to stay presentable. Every step from carrying water to emptying pots was manual and repeated daily. There were no shortcuts, no buttons to push or handles to turn. Just wood, cloth, ash, and time. And yet women did it. They washed, rinsed, wiped, and cleaned in the most basic conditions. Not for luxury, but for routine. Not for appearance, but for comfort. These spaces, as humble as they were, became important. They gave structures to the day and a sense of normalcy. Next, we'll explore how women use scents and flowers not just for decoration, but as quiet tools to manage sleep, stress, and unspoken discomfort. Even without soap, baths, or perfume bottles, women in the Middle Ages found their own ways to manage how they smelled. After all, personal scent was something others noticed quickly, especially in tight indoor spaces, thick clothes, and warm seasons. With little access to running water or regular bathing, the solution was not to get rid of the smell, but to cover it. And for noble women, or those in better households, scent became not just a necessity, but a quiet art. Herbs and flowers were the most common tools. Lavender, rosemary, mint, and sage were easy to grow in gardens and dried well. Women kept small cloth sachets filled with these herbs and tucked them into sleeves, bodices, or belts. When they moved, the warmth of their bodies helped release the scent. A single motion could spread the fragrance. It was subtle but effective, and it made a difference in crowded halls or during long days sitting in layers of wool. For more persistent odor, women used stronger methods. Oils infused with crushed herbs were dabbed behind the ears, under the neck, or near the wrists. These oils were usually mixed at home or by apothecaries, using olive oil, almond oil, or even animal fat as a base. Some were thick and greasy, leaving stains on linen collars, but women used them anyway, because the alternative was worse. Personally, I would rather risk a greasy collar than have people catch a whiff of 3-day-old sweat under 5 layers of clothing. Fresh flowers were a luxury. When available, women braided them into their hair or tucked them into folds of their sleeves. In spring and summer, rose petals or marigolds were popular. In colder months, dried petals stood in their place. These touches were both decorative and practical. The smell might not last long, but it gave the woman a moment of relief, a small sense of freshness, in a world where clean water was scarce. The bedroom was another space where scent mattered. Beds were large, shared, and often stuffy. Without proper ventilation, odor lingered on blankets, straw mattresses, and curtains. To deal with this, Women sometimes tied small bundles of dried lavender or thyme above the bed. These were called sleeping herbs. The smell helped mask the mustiness of old bedding, and some believed kept away illness. Some households scattered dried herbs on the floor, especially during feasts or visits. As people walked over them, the herbs crushed and released their smell. It was a way to freshen the room without cleaning it. In wealthier homes, servants refreshed these floors daily. In poorer homes, herbs were reused until they crumbled into dust. These days, people buy automatic air fresheners for every room. Back then, a handful of crushed thyme and a cracked window had to do the job. Certain herbs were chosen for specific reasons. Rosemary was believed to sharpen the mind. Lavender helped with sleep. Sage was thought to prevent illness. Women learned to mix and match these based on the time of day or the mood they wanted to set. While it may not have replaced bathing, it added some sense of control. For intimate hygiene, some women even applied herbs directly to underclothes. Linen strips or pads used during menstruation were sometimes sprinkled with mint or chamomile to reduce odor. This practice was shared quietly between mothers and daughters, passed down through demonstration rather than writing. It was personal knowledge, not public advice. Smelling pleasant was not just a matter of preference. It was part of how a woman was judged. A woman who smelled nice was assumed to be clean and proper, even if she had not bathed in weeks. That's the strange part about history. People didn't expect you to be clean. They expected you to appear clean. Scent became a kind of reputation. The right smell could hide poverty, illness, or fatigue. Women who worked in kitchens or near animals had harder time. Sweat and smoke stuck to skin and clothes. For them, sprigs of strong-smelling herbs were kept close at all times. They also chewed parsley or cloves to help with breath, especially if they had to speak to superiors. It was a practical solution, not a luxury. Wealthier women sometimes went further. They carried scented gloves, soaked in oils, and kept in boxes until needed. Gloves were worn to church or social visits, and when hands were raised in greeting, they released a pleasant scent. This detail became popular in noble courts and was mentioned in personal letters. A pair of good gloves could leave an impression long after the woman had left the room. It's a little funny how a bunch of flowers shoved into a sleeve could carry more social weight than an entire bath. When bathing was out of reach, scent filled the gap. And because everyone knew that real cleanliness was rare, people accepted the effort. A sprig of lavender, a scented comb, a drop of oil, these were quiet gestures, small rituals that helped women feel presentable, even confident. The rules were unspoken but widely followed. Never let your oil bottle be empty. Keep at least one sash under your bed pillow. If someone commented on the scent, always say it came from your laundry, even if your laundry had not been washed in a month. There was pride in this effort, even if no one talked about it. The scent also had emotional weight. For some women, a favorite flower reminded them of childhood, a visit to church, or a person they missed. The smell of rosemary might bring back a memory of someone gone. A piece of linen that still carried lavender might help a woman sleep better in a cold house. These were small comforts, but they mattered. Next, we'll step into the rituals of hair care, not for style or beauty, but for one simple goal: keeping it untangled, uninfested, and under control. Keeping it untangled, uninfested, and under control. During religious festivals or long journeys for pilgrimages, women faced even greater challenges in maintaining personal hygiene. The comforts of home, modest as they were still better than the conditions on the road without access to familiar spaces, tools, or water sources. Women had to adapt. Cleanness became a matter of improvisation and endurance. Women who prepared for travel often packed a small personal kit. It did not contain anything elaborate. Usually, it was a cloth pouch with a piece of soft linen, a few sprigs of herbs, and perhaps a comb. This was their hygiene kit. There were no disposable products, no bottles, no soap bars, just a few items that could be folded, reused, and tucked away. When stopping along the road, especially in groups, women looked for quiet corners, behind trees, or near low stone walls to handle quick washing. They rarely bathed. Water was scarce and meant for drinking or cooking. If they came across a stream, they might rinse their hands or splash water on their face, but nothing more. Full body washing was not expected, and in some cases, not even allowed. For Wok cleansing, some women used large leaves like those from fig or bok plants. These leaves were soft, wide, and could absorb a bit of water or oil. They were used to wipe sweat or dust from the skin, then discarded nearby. The act was simple and fast. No one lingered. No one looked. It was something done in silence with respect for each other's privacy. Personally, I would find it very difficult to clean up using a leaf while also worrying if someone's ox cart was about to round the corner. Pilgrimage routes were full of such moments. People moved together, but hygiene was handled alone. Women waited for early morning or dusk, hoping for some quiet. If they were traveling with men, they had to be even more careful. Layers of clothing helped create barriers, but not comfort. Some carried bundles of dried herbs like lavender or rosemary. These were pressed into the corners of their bags or tucked between layers of linen. The scent helped mask body odor, especially after days without bathing. The herbs also had a mild antibacterial property, though few people thought in those terms. It simply made them feel fresher. Water for washing was rarely reserved for women. Most of it went toward cooking or shared drinking. If a stream was nearby, the water might be used for feet or hands, but during summer, those streams could dry up. In winter, they froze. Either way, women learned to manage without. These days, we complain when a hotel room doesn't include shampoo. Back then, women crossed half of Europe with only a cloth and a twig in their pocket. Clothing helped to manage hygiene. Undergarments were changed whenever possible. A shift made of linen could be rinsed at a stopping point and dried on a rock, but that required sun, warmth, and time. Often women had neither, so they layered. One set for travel, one extra set for sleeping, if they had the luxury. Most only had one. Some women fasted during holy festivals, not only for religious reasons, but to limit bowel movements and avoid needing to clean themselves without resources. Others drank less water to avoid urinating on the road. These habits had side effects: headaches, fatigue, dizziness, but they were seen as part of the journey. During men ration, hygiene became even harder. Women carried folded cloth, reused and cleaned when possible. If there was no place to wash, they kept the used cloth wrapped and sealed until a stop allowed rinsing. Some burned them after use, depending on local belief or privacy concerns. It was common for women to go without a proper bath for weeks during long religious events. The lack of access was accepted. Dirt and smell became part of the experience. No one pointed it out. Everyone carried the same burden. Clothing held everything together. The long gowns, the thick cloaks, the headscarves. They trapped heat and odor, but also protected modesty. Women slept in their clothes, traveled in their clothes, and often arrived home in the same garments they had left in. Once home, washing became a priority. At large religious gatherings, some towns set up communal washing stations, but these were limited and often crowded. Water was reused, basins filled with cloudy water, no privacy, no soap, and little time. Women stood in line, waited their turn, rinsed quickly, and then moved on. It was not about feeling clean. It was about doing what was possible. It's a little funny how people could spend a whole month traveling in devotion. Yet, the first thing they prayed for upon returning was likely a bucket of clean water. When the festivals ended or the pilgrimage was complete, women returned home with sore feet, dusty hair, and layers of dried sweat. Cleaning up took days. Clothes were soaked. Hair was combed. Feet were scrubbed with vinegar or ash. The clothes in their pouches were replaced. The leaves long forgotten by the roadside. Even so, the experience was meaningful. It was difficult, yes, but also sacred. Women accepted that keeping clean during these times would be limited. Their efforts were quiet, often unnoticed. A handful of herbs, a quick rinse behind a rock, a cloth folded with care. These moments were not grand, but they mattered. The memory of discomfort stayed with them. They remembered the places where they had no water. The nights when they tried to sleep with sticky skin. The mornings when a leaf had to do. These were not glamorous stories, but they were real, and they repeated every year with every new journey. Next, we'll look at how women cared for their hair, not for beauty, but simply to prevent knots bugs, and the endless pull of tangled threads. After finding ways to mask their scent with herbs and oils, medieval women still had to consider something even more complex than poor plumbing or limited water. They had to navigate a tangled web of superstitions and taboos surrounding personal hygiene. Bathing was not just about cleaning the body. It was also tangled up with beliefs about health, morality, and even the unseen world. Some people believed that bathing too often could drain the body's strength. For women, this fear took on a specific shape. It was said that regular washing might weaken fertility, cause miscarriages, or disturb the balance of the female body. Cold water, in particular, was viewed with suspicion. The idea was that exposing yourself to water, especially during menstruation, opened the body to illness or spiritual harm. Because of this, many women avoided full body baths when they were on their period. Instead, they focused on washing only small areas using cloths and herbal infusions. Lukewarm water was considered safer than cold. Hot water was a luxury and rarely available. The idea of temperature was more than comfort. It was a protective measure. Personally, I don't blame them. If I had to carry, boil, and test every pot of water by hand, I would probably be just as cautious. Older women were especially careful. The elderly were warned not to bathe at night, even if the air was warm. People believed that warm baths opened the pores and made the body vulnerable to bad air or sudden chills. This is where the phrase catching a chill became more than a saying. It was seen as a real danger. A sudden shift in temperature was thought to let disease slip into the body through the skin. To avoid these risks, many families had rules about when bathing was allowed. Morning was safer than night. Spring was safer than might. Spring was safer than winter. Women were told to avoid bathing after eating, after crying, or during storms. If thunder was nearby, water was off limits. These ideas might seem strange now, but they were part of a larger worldview where the body was open, fragile, and connected to forces beyond control. Today, people debate whether to shower in the morning or at night. In the Middle Ages, the debate was whether to bathe at all without summoning bad luck. These beliefs did not come from nowhere. People observed the world around them and made patterns from what they saw. If someone bathed and got sick soon after, the two events were connected. If a child washed in cold water and caught a fever, the water became the cause. Without science to explain bacteria or viruses, people used stories and shared knowledge to explain what happened. This kind of thinking affected not only women's hygiene, but also their habits throughout life. Girls were taught early on to be careful about washing. A mother might tell her daughter never to bathe during her bleeding days, never to rinse her hair in cold weather, and never to use rainwater left in open buckets. These were not worn out of cruelty, but concern. Washing hands and face was less restricted, but still shaped by belief. Cold water in the morning was thought to shock the system awake. But for women, too much exposure to cold water could invite headaches or womb troubles. So some preferred to let the cloth sit near the fire first. Then they gently pressed it to their skin, moving slowly, keeping their breath calm. There were also warnings about communal baths in cities or towns that had public baths. Gossip spread quickly about which ones were cursed, which were unclean, and which might lead to temptation. Women were told not to share bath water with strangers. Some carried their own herbs to toss into the tub. Others avoided public baths entirely and chose to wash at home using their own basin. Even touching river water came with its own rules. In some villages, streams were believed to hold spirits. Washing clothes in the wrong place or at the wrong time of day might anger them. Women whispered stories of those who got sick after scrubbing laundry during sunset. Whether it was real or not didn't matter. Fear-shaped behavior. It's a little funny how staying clean was often seen as more dangerous than staying dirty. Despite all this, women found ways to keep up their routines. They worked around the warnings. If a bath was not allowed, a warm cloth was enough. If cold water was feared, they used herbal steam instead. Some burned herbs in their rooms and stood nearby to absorb the scent and the supposed cleansing. It was not perfect, but it was what they had. These taboos also affected how women cared for others. Mothers avoided bathing newborns in the first days of life. They believed that a thin layer of birth residue protected the baby. Bathing too early was said to invite fevers, so they waited, wiping gently, but avoiding full immersion until the child was stronger. Pregnant women were told not to wash their bellies with cold water. Some feared it would cause cramps or even miscarriage. These ideas came from observations, shared pain, and generational fear. No one wanted to risk a life over a bath. So caution became the rule, even if it meant weeks without washing. These days we read ingredients on soap bottles and argue over Skinner routines. Back then, soap was rare, water was risky, and fear shaped every decision. In the end, these beliefs became part of daily life. They were not questioned often. Instead, they were followed, passed down, and accepted. Even if they lacked proof, they gave people a sense of control. For women especially, following these rules meant safety, tradition, and sometimes survival. Next, we'll follow the hairbrush. Because keeping clean was one thing, but keeping your hair in place was an entirely different challenge. After navigating the complicated beliefs around bathing, women still had to think carefully about the clothes they wore closest to their bodies. Underwear, especially for those who were not wealthy, was not something taken for granted. For many medieval women, owning even 1 or 2 linen undergarments was considered fortunate. These were not decorative pieces, but practical items that needed to be used again and again. Linen was the fabric of choice because it absorbed moisture and felt more comfortable than rougher materials like wool. But linen was not cheap, and making even a single pair of drawers or a chemise took time and labor. Spinning, weaving, cutting, and sewing all had to be done by hand. Most women did not have a wardrobe full of options. They rotated between 2 or 3 basic items and hoped they lasted through the season. At night, underwear was often rinsed by hand and hung to dry in the sleeping area. Women avoided hanging such garments outside. Even in summer, modesty was important. And letting others see one's intimate clothing was seen as improper. So instead, a wooden peg near the bed or a rope strung across the room served as the drying line. Personally, I can't imagine falling asleep next to wet laundry, but that was their reality, not a choice. Of course, hair drying overnight didn't always work. If the weather was damp or the cloth was thick, the garment might still be wet in the morning. Putting on damp underwear was uncomfortable and sometimes led to skin irritation, especially in summer. Women who worked in the fields or stayed seated for hours could end up with rashes, chafing, or worse. In winter, the problem was different. Cold, wet fabric pressed against the skin could lead to chills or even infections. Some women tried to solve this by wrapping the garment near the hearth or placing it under the blanket while they slept. Others simply endured it. They had no dryers or extra sets to switch into. They made do with what they had. Today, we complain if our dryer is slow. Back then, waiting for a single undergarment to dry could shape a whole morning. For many, underwear was not even worn regularly. Some women, especially in rural areas, skipped the layer entirely during certain seasons. Long skirts and woolen stockings provided enough coverage, and in some cultures, undergarments were viewed as unnecessary or even wasteful. Fabric had other uses, and if something tore or thinned, it was often turned into rags or reused in some other way. When undergarments became too worn, women patched them repeatedly. These patches were sewn carefully but discreetly. Some added an extra layer inside to make the garment last longer. Others removed frayed edges and stitched around the hole to keep it from growing. These repairs were not only signs of frugality, but also of survival. The woman who could keep one item useful for months was respected for her skill. Quilting old linen into new padding was also common. Some women used scraps from worn undergarments as extra lining in their outer clothes. Others turned the cloth into makeshift sanitary protection or washcloths. Nothing was wasted. Every piece of fabric had a second life. It was a rhythm of use, wash, mend, and reuse. In wealthier households, ladies might own more pairs of fine linen undergarments, often embroidered or edged with lace. These were cared for by maids who washed and dried them out of sight. Perfumed water or floral sachet was sometimes placed in linen chest to keep the item smelling pleasant. But even in castles, privacy was limited. Maids had to act with discretion, folding and storing underwear as if it were a sacred duty. It's a little funny that the most private items in a woman's life were often the ones most handled by someone else. Some women also slept without underwear to allow their bodies to breathe. This was based on folk advice passed down from mothers or midwives. They believed that resting the skin helped prevent infections and balance the body's humors. These ideas may sound unscientific now, but they were rooted in the best understanding available at the time. Washing undergarments required care. Hot water could shrink or damage the cloth, so most used lukewarm water mixed with lye soap or ashes. They rubbed gently, then rinsed several times. After wringing it out, they laid it flat or hung it away from direct sunlight to avoid fading. The goal was to make it clean enough to reuse, not spotless. If there was a special occasion, such as a religious feast or a visit to a shrine, women sometimes prepared their finest linen. This meant ironing with a smooth stone or wooden paddle, folding neatly and perfuming with lavender or rose petals. For one day, they could feel fresh, even if nothing else in their life changed. Girls learned about undergarment care at an early age. Helping their mothers rinse, sew, or fold was part of growing up. They understood the cycle of use and the limits of what they owned. A lost piece was a serious matter, not something easily replaced. During illness or childbirth, undergarments were often sacrificed. If blood or discharge stained the fabric, it might be buried or burned instead of washed. People feared disease might cling to cloth. Some believed that washing such garments brought bad luck. In these cases, women chose caution over thrift. Even in times of travel, women packed at most 2 spare sets. If that, they wrapped them in cloth and tucked them deep in their baggage. When they found time to wash, they did it quietly in secluded places, away from men and strangers. Cleanliness, even in underwear, was tied to dignity. These days, buying a 6-pack of cotton briefs takes 5 minutes and a trip to the store. Back then, keeping one clean and dry felt like a victory. In every fold of fabric, there was a quiet story. A woman's health, her habits, her dignity, all stitched into something no one was supposed to see. But without it, she was vulnerable. She was exposed not just to the elements, but to shame. Next, we'll step outside the home because staying clean inside was hard enough. But public spaces had hygiene rules of their own. Once the underwear had been washed, dried, and stored out of sight, many medieval women turned their attention to something else that mattered to them just as much, even if they never said it out loud: their skin. While they had no fancy skin care aisles or colorful glass bottles, they still found ways to take care of their faces using what they had in the kitchen. It was not about vanity. It was about feeling a bit more human in a world where grime was constant. One of the most common ingredients was egg. A raw egg, cracked open and sepped. Aerated gave them 2 useful parts. The yolk was thought to nourish the skin. The white could tighten it. Women would spread it on their cheeks, wait for it to dry, then rinse it off with warm water if they were lucky enough to have any. Some said it helped with redness. Others just liked how smooth it felt. Honey was another favorite. It was sticky and took time to apply, but many believed it softened the skin and helped with blemishes. A small spoonful would be spread across the face and left for several minutes. After that, it was wiped off with a damp cloth. If the honey came from local bees, it was thought to be even better. Some women mixed it with crushed herbs or dried flower petals for extra effect. Personally, I think I'd hesitate before smearing honey on my face. But when choices are few, the sticky method starts to look more reasonable. Rice water, or water left after rinsing grains before cooking, was also kept for skin care. It was used to rinse the face or soak cloths to place over tired eyes. Women believed it helped with complexion and soothed irritation. Since rice was expensive in some regions, not everyone had access to this method, but when they did, they used it all. Nothing went to waste. For tired or swollen eyes, women turned to fresh mint leaves or chamomile, soaked in water. They lay back with the herbs placed directly on their eyelids and waited in silence. There was no music, no candlelight, no soft towels, just the cool feeling of leaves and the hope it would help reduce puffiness. It was quiet care done in corners of the home, often away from others. Today, we browse hundreds of skincare options in 10 minutes. Back then, women had to make a decision between using their food or wearing it. Sometimes women would make masks using flour mixed with water or oil. The paste was applied to the face and allowed to dry into a thin crust. This was sa. To draw out impurities, though no one quite knew what those were. Other women used cross strawberries, boiled apple mash, or even ground mustard seeds. The effect might have been psychological as much as physical. A small ritual in a day filled with chores and discomfort. The knowledge of these methods came from other women. There were no books, no written recipes. Daughters learned by watching their mothers. Friends whispered suggestions while spinning wool. Midwives sometimes offered tips along with herbal remedies. It was word of mouth, not science, but it traveled well. And across regions, women shared what worked and what didn't. Some added lavender or rosemary to oils to rub into the skin, not just for scent, but because it made the body feel warm in winter. Ointments made from pig fat or beeswax were rubbed on rough patches or used to prevent chafing. If a woman had access to almond oil, she used it sparingly. If not, she relied on animal fats and herbs. Storage was tricky. There were no glass jars or refrigeration. Ingredients had to be used quickly or kept in clay pots sealed with cloth. Most women kept their supplies in a wooden box or a small pouch tied to their bedpost. These items were not for display. They were hidden, protected from dust and from curious hands. It's a little funny to imagine someone guarding a handful of mint leaves, like it was treasure. But for them, it was. Not every attempt worked. Some women developed rashes. Others found their skin dried out even more. But there was no dermatologist to consult. You either stopped using it or tried something else. And since many believed skin problems were signs of inner sin or imbalance, they didn't always blame the remedy. Women who worked outdoors were especially vulnerable to dry, cracked skin. Wind, sun, smoke, and sweat all left their mark. A thin layer of oil or a soft cloth wrap was sometime. So all they had to protect their cheeks. For noble women, staying inside offered some relief, but even they faced smoke from hearths and dryness from cold stone rooms. On special days, women used extra care. A holiday feast or church visit might be reason enough to prepare the face more carefully. Little oil rubbed in, a bit of color added from beet juice or wine sediment. Nothing too flashy, just enough to appear fresh and rested. Girls began learning these things early. By the time they were 12 or 13, they knew what leaves to pick, what mixtures felt too rough, and how long to leave something on before it's done. They learned the hard way. Trial and error. A sting meant to take it off. A tingle meant wait. No one explained, but they understood through habit. Seasonal changes affected everything. Seasonal changes affected everything. In summer, ingredients spoiled faster. In winter, oils hardened. A woman had to adapt, use different herbs, shorten the timing. Some mixed warm water with ash from the hearth, not for cleaning, but to soothe their skin after a day near the fire. Despite the effort, no one expected flawless skin. Freckles, sunspots, redness, these were common and rarely hidden. But a small glow, a smoother cheek, a hint of softness, those were considered signs of good care, not beauty, just effort. In a world where almost nothing felt private or controlled, caring for your face in secret might have been the closest thing to peace. So they continued with eggs and honey, herbs and patience passed down not through books, but through hands. Their skin, a routine fits inside a wooden spoon and a square, and somehow it lasted for centuries. Next, we'll step into the mouth again, but this time not for teeth. The breath of a woman said more than words, and they had ways to manage that too. The everyday routine of medieval women was already difficult, but the days surrounding childbirth brought new kinds of challenges. It started with the lack of clean water. In many homes, water had to be fetched from a stream or well, and by the time it reached the birthing room, it was no longer fresh. That meant the women helping with the birth had to improvise. Cloths were boiled, not always thoroughly, and used to clean the newborn. A mother, meanwhile, was often too weak to move, lying still on a straw-filled mattress that absorbed not just her sweat, but blood and fluids from the birth. There was no clean hospital bed, no soft linens. The straw bed became damp within hours. It was rarely changed, only topped up with dry layers. The room smelled strongly of iron and milk. Sometimes herbs were burned in the corner to hide the scent, but it didn't help much. The women attending the birth, often midwives or older female relatives, worked in heavy dresses and sleeves rolled up. Their tools were limited: a cloth, a basin, a knife if needed, and their hands, if needed, and their hands. After the baby was born, the mother wasn't given much rest. She remained in bed for days, unable to wash properly. Warm water for wiping came once or twice a day, usually boiled with herbs. Someone would gently sponge her body with a cloth, avoiding wounds. The same cloth might be used more than once. Women weren't encouraged to move for fear they would leak or make the bed messier. They lay still, sometimes unable to eat properly, sweating through nights and scratching at skin made itchy by hay and heat. There's something deeply ironic about celebrating new life in a room that smells like wet grass and iron pans. And yet, this was normal. The recovery period wasn't measured by days, but by how long it took the bleeding to stop. For some, it took a week. For others, longer. There were no painkillers except perhaps a bit of or some herbal infusion. No doctor unless the birth went badly. And if it did go badly, there were no guarantees anyone could help. One of the small mercies was the practice of herbal steaming. Women were sometimes seated over a basin filled with boiling water and herbs like mugwort, chamomile, or lavender. The steam helped ease swelling and clean the body in ways they couldn't manage with cloths alone. It was done in silence behind closed doors, with women shielding the mother from cold air and prying eyes. The process was slow and made them sweat, but they believed it helped cleanse the womb. The baby, meanwhile, was wiped and wrapped quickly. No soft baby wipes. No clean towels, just squares of fabric, sometimes old cloth from worn-out dresses. The baby's skin was rubbed with oil or lard, then swaddled tightly. Crying was considered healthy. Too quiet, and people worried too loud, and they blamed the weather. Breastfeeding began right away if the mother was strong enough. Otherwise, another woman might step in. If a modern mother had to give birth on a pile of straw with nothing but a boiled rag and a bowl of herbs, she'd probably sue the hospital. But medieval women didn't expect comfort. They only hoped for survival. The room wasn't cleaned, just left to dry on its own. Sometimes the blood dried into the floorboards. The baby slept near the mother, wrapped tightly while the house carried on around them. Life didn't pause for the newborn. Food had to be cooked. Firewood still needed chopping. There were customs, of course. Some families buried the birthing straw in the garden to ward off illness. Others burned it to erase bad luck. The midwife washed her hands with alcohol or vinegar, more for ritual than sanitation. Women weren't allowed to leave the house until a churching ceremony was held. That could be days or weeks later. Until then, the mother was considered unclean. She couldn't attend Mass, touch holy things, or be part of household events. What stays with me most is not the pain or even the blood, but how much was endured without complaint. Generations of women went through childbirth in these conditions, and many did it more than once. They knew the risks. Still, they continued. They shared recipes for herbal compresses, passed down cloths from one daughter to another, and whispered quiet words of advice that had survived centuries. There's no luxury in that story, no softness, just straw, blood, and a steaming bowl of leaves. Soon, we'll leave the birthing room and turn to the difference between women of noble and peasant birth. The tools might be different, but the struggle was often the same. After childbirth, when the body was sore and the mind exhausted, what happened next declassed largely on who you were. A noble woman recovering in a chamber, lined with tapestries and thick curtains, could expect some degree of care. Her ladies-in-waiting brought warm water, maybe even infused with rose petals or rosemary. They had soft cloths, sometimes made of imported linen, and knew how to clean the body gently. A quiet fire burned nearby, and the windows were shut to keep out the chill. But for peasant women, things looked different. They were lucky to have a roof that didn't leak. The birthing straw was taken out, and maybe if someone had time, fresh straw was brought in. Water was fetched from the stream again, cold and full of leaves. No scented herbs, just water, a piece of old cloth, and the breeze from a cracked wooden wall. The woman washed herself sitting on a stool in the corner, hoping no one would walk in. It's funny how people think wealth only means gold and clothes. In reality, it meant warm water and a second pair of hands. For noble women, bathing wasn't exactly luxurious, but it was manageable. Some households had bathtubs, simple wooden ones lined with cloth. Water was heated in kettles and poured in slowly. The lady might be helped in by her servant, then dried with care, and rubbed with oils or powder to cover any lingering odor. Poor women had no such option. A bath for them meant squatting in the open, or behind a curtain. In the winter, they barely washed. The cold bit at their skin, and heating water was a rare treat. They wiped instead, using a damp rag or snow if nothing else was available. And once the baby came, their focus turned to survival. Cleanliness was nice, but feeding the family came first. I once heard someone say that suffering is the same for everyone. I disagree. It's not the same when you're wet, cold, and alone. The dignity of privacy was a luxury. Noble women bathed behind screens, sometimes even while seated, using a servant to hand them cloth and basin. Peasant women had to rely on family members to step outside or just hoped that no one was looking. Even the tools were different. Wealthier women had small boxes for their hygiene items. Inside might be scented cloth, combs carved from ivory or polished wood, and bottles of oil. Poorer women kept their few belongings wrapped in cloth, tucked away in a corner. Their combs were simple and cracked. Their clothes were reused until they tore. There was no box, just a corner of a shelf or under the bed. That division also affected how women were perceived. A noble woman who smelled pleasant was considered graceful. A peasant who smelled of smoke and soil was expected to. People judged harshly, even though the options weren't equal. One woman had thyme oil dabbed behind her ears. The other had hay stuck to her dress. Neither had much choice. It amazes me how women of different classes shared the same body, yet were treated as though they belonged to separate species. That contrast wasn't just about money. It shaped the daily routine. One woman dried herself with linen, another waited for the sun to dry her back. And then came the question of silence. Noble women were expected to keep their hygiene private. Servants were trained to look away, to never speak of what they saw. It was a kind of invisible rule known by all but written by none. For peasants, there was no such protection. Washing was often done near animals, near children, near husbands. There was no shame, but also no mystery. But one thing united them. No matter how fine the basin or how plain the cloth, every woman had to deal with the same body, sweat, dirt, blood, the same needs, the same discomfort, just different methods. If I had to choose, I'd take a single pot of warm water over a pile of gold, any day. That's what mattered in the end. A moment to clean, a space to breathe, a cloth that hadn't been used 5 times before. Coming up next, we'll look at how women handled grooming in ways you might not expect. Shaving, plucking, even trimming down there, all without razors as we know them. Once, a medieval woman stepped beyond her home. Her control over cleanliness became a gamble. The comforts of clothes, herbs, and warm water stayed behind. Outside, there were no public restrooms, no private corners designed for personal needs, and certainly no understanding from society if something went wrong. A trip to the market or a journey to visit family might seem simple today. But back then, it meant navigating a whole day with almost no hygienic infrastructure. Before leaving the house, women prepared in small ways. They tied a cloth bundle under their apron or slipped a rag into a pocket if their dress had one. Wealthier women might carry a pouch containing dried herbs or a small vial of scented water. This wasn't luxury. It was a basic strategy. These items were used not only to refresh the hands and face, but to help mask any body odor that built up under thick, unventilated layers of clothing. They knew that after a few hours of walking, working, or even standing in the heat among people, their bodies would start to sweat. There would be no place to freshen up once the day began. If you think forgetting deodorant is bad, imagine being stuck all day in the sun with wool skirts and only a rag to help you. For most women, this was normal. They couldn't count on finding privacy outside the home, so they learned how to manage. A quick moment behind a hay cart, a pause behind a tree near the churchyard. In some villages, women waited until the streets cleared out, then slipped into a quiet corner of the marketplace, hoping no one was watching. There was no shame in it, just a quiet code of survival. They often avoided drinking much before leaving, just to reduce the need to relieve themselves. But bodies don't always cooperate. So when nature called, they did what they had to do. Sometimes a cloth was laid down, sometimes just lifted quickly, and afterward they wiped with a bit of rag or even a clean section of their underdress. That piece of cloth would be folded away discreetly, kept until it could be rinsed at home in the prowess of their own wash basin. No one ever spoke of these routines out loud. They weren't taboo, just silently understood. I admire how quietly they handled something so difficult with no complaint and no support. There was no education about hygiene, no suggestions from elders on what to pack. Everything was learned through observation, trial, and the occasional whispered advice from mother to daughter. Girls learned which parts of their dress could be sacrificed, how to fold cloth to catch moisture, and when it was better to wait than to risk being seen. When walking to nearby towns or heading out on long pilgrimages, women adapted their routine even more. Some carried extra rags tucked into their sleeves or bundled with bread and dried fruit in a cloth bag. They selected darker underclothes for travel, knowing stains would be less obvious. If they menstruated during travel, things became far more complex. Some used folded wool or soft straw layered between layers of linen. Others stayed home entirely during those weeks, fearing the embarrassment of having no clean place to change. The weather made everything worse. In summer, sweat mixed with dust and stuck to every crease of fabric. In winter, water froze in pouches and hands, became too stiff to manage cloth properly. And yet, women went out. They visited relatives, took care of errands, and participated in markets. Some even gave birth on the road. And still, their first instinct was to clean what they could with whatever was nearby. It might be snow or a jug of cold water carried for miles. No one had hot towels or clean gloves. They used what they had and kept moving. Compared to today's travel kits, they basically had a rag and resilience. But it worked more or less. They kept their dignity through preparation, a little foresight, and a lot of quiet adjustment. Some women even carried herbs like rosemary or lavender tied to a ribbon and pinned to their inner layer of clothing just to keep a pleasant scent nearby. It didn't eliminate odor, but it softened it. On market days, things got especially crowded. The stalls were packed, animals moved through the streets, and smells mixed together in overwhelming layers between raw meat, human sweat, and manure. The entire square carried a heaviness in the air. A woman who wanted to stand apart might pause before entering to pat her face with a scented cloth or smooth her hair with a damp rag. These gestures weren't about vanity. They were survival tactics in a sensory storm. I sometimes wonder how many of them held their breath through the entire marketplace. Probably a lot. But more than that, they smiled, bartered, carried baskets, then returned home with potatoes and soap. Then finally back inside, they would quietly clean themselves. They'd rinse the cloths used during the trip, hang them to dry behind doors or near hearths, and perhaps boil the worst ones. No praise, no acknowledgement, just the silent pride of having kept everything under control, with no help and no scene. Not all women had the same resources. Noble women might have a servant follow behind with a water flask, or a second set of gloves, in case the first became too dirty. They could rest in the back room of a merchant's house if needed, but peasants did everything themselves. They wrapped cloths in aprons, branded their privacy with sharp glances, and walked for hours with blisters on their feet and sore backs. Their standards were the same. Their methods were simply more limited. What stays with me is not the hardship, but how they planned around it so calmly. A spring rig of mint, a small bottle of rosewater, a folded piece of cloth, and an exit strategy. That was their survival kit, and it worked because it had to. In the next part, we'll return home once more and look at how seasonal changes, especially during the coldest months, made hygiene even more complicated, when water froze in buckets and washing meant risking illness. Even the simplest acts of cleanliness became a daily dilemma. As women aged in the medieval world, the way they managed personal hygiene changed drastically. The body slowed down, the joints stiffened, the skin became thinner and more sensitive. What had once been a routine of cloth, herbs, and carefully timed privacy often gave way to something simpler and sometimes more resigned. In old age, hygiene was no longer just a daily task. It became a negotiation between comfort, dignity, and what the body could still tolerate. Elderly women, especially those from wealthier families, were usually not left alone to care for themselves. Daughters, granddaughters, or female servants often took over the daily responsibilities of washing, dressing, and brushing their hair. For some older women, this was a relief. For others, it was uncomfortable. Modesty didn't fade with age, and many still felt embarrassed at needing help with something so personal. But practical needs outweighed pride. A helping hand was better than slipping on wet stone or freezing from an attempt to wash alone. I sometimes think the hardest part of growing old is letting someone else scrub behind your ears. In noble households, the elderly might have access to warm basins, scented cloths, and gentle care. The water was usually infused with warm wine or herbs like marjoram or thyme to soothe the skin. They were wrapped in thick linens after being cleaned, often in front of a fire. The servants doing the work were discreet and trained to say nothing. Silence was part of the job. In peasant homes, the experience was rougher. There were no special tubs or expensive cloths. Washing happened by the hearth or in a corner of the room, sometimes with snow in winter or lukewarm well water in summer. A daughter-in-law might dip a rag in warm beer and wipe her mother-in-law's hands and face. That was the extent of a bath in some seasons. Full body washing was rare, too dangerous, too difficult, and as some believed, too unhealthy. Elderly women often refused to bathe in water altogether. They feared the chill, even with a fire burning nearby. Some thought their bones would ache worse after a bath. Others simply didn't want to be seen naked at that age. Instead, they requested warm cloth soaked in wine or asked to be rubbed down with herbal vinegar. This method removed some sweat and odor, but it wasn't thorough. Over time, the smell of the body simply became part of the room. Compared to modern elder care where routines are written on whiteboards, these women managed with memory, patience, and wine-soaked rags, and no one complained. Smells were part of life. When someone visited a home with an old woman, they expected a certain mustiness in the air. It wasn't offensive, it just was. People knew that once the body aged past a certain point, it lived by different rules. Tooth care also faded as women aged. If they had any teeth left, they might still rub them with a cloth dipped in salt or herbs. But many elderly women lost teeth early and simply stopped bothering. They ate softer foods, soaked bread in broth, and spoke carefully. A toothache in old age could be lie. Kente in old age could be lie. Threatening, as few dared attempt extractions. Infection was feared more than foul breath. Hair became thin and white. Some let it grow and tied it under simple linen caps. Some let it grow and tied it under simple linen caps. Others had their family help trim it short. Brushing it remained important, not just for appearance but to prevent matting. A matted head was a sign of neglect, and no woman wanted to be seen that way, even near death. On quiet evenings, some daughters would sit and brush their mother's hair by firelight, using old combs passed down through generations. What strikes me is how hygiene became an act of love near the end. It wasn't about cleanliness anymore. It was about care, tenderness, and time. Sitting with someone as you wiped their hands, offering warm wine to wash their feet. These moments said more than words ever could. These moments said more than words ever could. In the absence of soap or hot baths, they offered comfort. In winter, hygiene nearly stopped. Water froze. Firewood was precious. Firewood was precious. Old women were wrapped in layers and stayed near the fire. Their underclothes were rarely changed unless they soiled them. In such cases, Rags were boiled and reused, and the mattress was aired if possible. Some women wore the same shift for weeks, covered by thick gowns and aprons. It was not ideal, but survival came first. Freshness could wait until spring, and still they tried. A clean cloth on the forehead, a few drops of rosewater behind the ears, lavender under the pillow. These weren't luxuries. They were final gestures of dignity, a way to remain human. Even as the body began to fail, no one expected old women to smell like flowers, but many tried anyway. Modern nursing homes may have antiseptic wipes and personal hygiene charts, but back then, warmth and privacy were all that mattered. A good death for many women included having their bodies wiped gently and their hair brushed smooth. Families understood this. Before burial, it was common for the female relatives to wash the body one last time, comb the hair, and wrap the woman in her cleanest linen. Not because it changed anything for the dead, but because it mattered to the living. The final years of life were quiet. The body slowed. The routine shrank, but hygiene remained in some form until the end. It wasn't about soap or perfect hair. It was about being seen, being touched, being cared for when you couldn't care for yourself. I think what lasted most was the sense of being known by your smell, your cloth, your habits. Each old woman left behind a scent, a rhythm, a memory of how she kept herself clean, in a world that didn't make it easy, that more than anything is what her family remembered. In our final part, we'll gather all these pieces together. From youth to old age, from nobility to peasantry, the story of medieval women's hygiene was one of quiet struggle, private rituals, and unspoken strength. Even with no modern bathrooms, no soap bars, and no privacy, medieval women still found ways to care for themselves. Their hygiene habits were simple, often rough, but grounded in tradition and daily effort. They didn't chase after beauty. They aimed for dignity. For most, that meant staying clean enough to not draw attention and modest enough to never speak about it. They reused cloths, washed with herb-infused water, and avoided strong smells by staying quiet and neat. Mothers passed down their knowledge in short instructions, usually while working together. How to rinse with rosemary water, how to clean certain body parts more carefully, how to keep a cloth dry for reuse. These things weren't written in books. They were whispered from generation to generation. They probably knew more about how to stay clean with 5 items than we do with 50. Cleanliness wasn't about showing off. It was about control, about doing what you could with what little you had. A woman with no soap still found a way to use ashes or salt. One without perfume tucked lavender into her bodice or sleeve. If she had no warm water, she used wine. If she had no towel, she let herself air dry. The point was not to impress, but to avoid shame. In today's world of constant advertising, it's almost refreshing to think of women who did it only for themselves. Even in their final years, hygiene was part of life. Older women, often frail and cold, refused to bathe in full water. Instead, they wiped down with warm wine or a cloth soaked in herbs. Younger relatives or servants helped with care, but no one spoke of it aloud. The scent of aging, of sweat, of the body fading, was no longer something to hide. It became part of the home, part of the rhythm. Still, pride remained. A clean shift, a brushed braid. A cloth was folded carefully beside the bed. These little things said, "I'm still here. I still care." That attitude crossed all classes. A noble woman with a personal maid might own rose oil and fresh linen. A farmer's wife might only have a bucket of water and some mint. But both tried, and both believed that a proper woman should never offend others with her smell or mess. Quiet cleanliness was a way to keep one's place, even in a chaotic world. What I admire most is that no one had to remind them. They just knew. By now, we've seen how hygiene shaped their days. From washing their faces with cold water in the morning to hiding cloth pads during their monthly cycles, to freshening their mouths with salt or wine. Every step was done without complaint and often without being seen. They didn't need approval. They didn't need applause. Just space, habit, and time. And that's what made it last. These quiet routines, though basic, carried through centuries. They taught resilience, patience, and the value of caring for one's body, even when the world did hard. So, next time you step into a hot shower or open a bottle of scented shampoo, Think back for a second. Think of the women who had none of that. They cleaned themselves with a cloth and a cup of boiled herbs, who smelled of the earth, the fire, and sometimes lavender. Who didn't complain? Who just got on with it? They didn't have spas or salons, but they had pride and they had routine. And sometimes that's more powerful. Thank you for staying with this story. Through each part, we followed their quiet efforts, their secrets, and their simple wins. It's been a calm journey through steam, cloth, and silence. Tonight, sleep knowing that even in the hardest times, women still found ways to feel human. Good night.